Hello everybody, my name's Hikikomori Hermitage and welcome to Pirates and Power Holders. I've been working on this for the last year or so and I'm excited to finally be able to unveil it to you all. I am a huge One Piece fan. I'm sitting here surrounded by merchandise and I've spent the last year working on a book, Pirates and Power Holders, that would effectively translate One Piece in all of its attributes to the rules of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. There's been a lot of clamor for this sort of content, not in the least of which because of the One Piece D&D podcast run by Daniel Rustage. I'm not going to hide the fact that I'm a fan. And I wanted to help. But first, some points of order. As you can see here on the section that I've displayed, I'm not associated with anyone. This is not an official book. It's entirely fan-made. It's all mine. For better and for worse. Which is the second point of order. Nothing has been playtested. This, and I cannot stress this enough, is the beta. It is the Unearthed Arcana. I cannot guarantee that everything in this book is properly balanced. Maybe some things are overpowered, maybe some things are underpowered. And I am hoping that all of you in the audience will be able to help me. That in response to these rules, and then in response to your feedback to these rules, it can be updated and perfected into something that is much better. And that is the other thing, it will be updated. It will be updated in response to feedback. But that also means that this version you see here is not the final version. The version that is in this video is not the final version, and some of the information in it may be outdated by the time you get around to it. You can find the book in the description below. You can find a link to the PDF file. It is a Google Drive file. You can download it, share it, do whatever you like with it. But the purpose of this video is to go through it, to discuss it, to give some further explanation into what I did and why, and maybe preemptively answer some of your questions. So first, the big question is, what is Pirates and Power Holders? As said before, it is a book that works to translate the rules of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition and the uniqueness of the One Piece world and bring them together. So what is included? I apologize in advance also. There's no script here. I'm going off the cuff. Enjoy. First is the structure of the world. As said before, I am a huge One Piece fan. I watched One Piece for the first time about 4 years ago, and I'm currently wrapping up my second full watch through, not including all of the individual arcs I've rewatched at various points. It's easy for me to sometimes forget that not everybody has abundant knowledge of how the One Piece world works. Some people are more casual fans, and I also wanted to help non-fans. I also wanted to create a book so thorough and authentic that even someone who had never watched the series, never read the manga, could make an authentic experience for his players, who maybe are big One Piece fans. I didn't want to gatekeep, I didn't want to lock anyone out. And so a portion of this book, a fairly substantial portion, is spent on the basics. What is the One Piece world? What are the necessities? What are things that you can cut out? What are things that you have to include? Things such as that, and we will go over that in a minute. Magic classes and what to do about it. That's the big question, isn't it? Of course, Dungeons & Dragons is largely based around magic, and magic can do a lot of really, really funky things. Things that do not make sense in the One Piece world. Of course, the simple explanation is just to translate out magic entirely, but I find that answer unconvincing, and I've gone into detail about what precisely you can do, and we'll go over that in time as well. Races. Right now, just like Whole Cake Island, all of the races of the One Piece world are included except for two, Giants and Lunarians. The Lunarian race will be added. That is a guarantee. It will be added. Giants, not so much. Giant player characters aren't really workable. They aren't. And they haven't been included in the book. And that's not even mentioning the fact there are Giants in 5th edition. There's not much translating to do there. But everybody else, all those other races you can find. You can play as a fisherman. You can play even specifically as an octopus fisherman. And we'll get to that. Devil fruits and Haki. This is one of the other big things about translating One Piece. And believe me, we will get to that. But we do have a full Haki system, and the devil fruits have their own rules and regulations that we will certainly go over. Travel, I have a unique travel table, and because it is a pirate campaign, I wanted travel to be authentic, realistic, and that is something you'll learn about me as a person, as a DM. I value realism, so some of these rules may be too strict. Some of them may be too constricting, because that is who I am, so keep that in mind. That is a bias going forward, but I go a lot into travel mechanics and crew mechanics. And finally, the little things. This goes back to what I was saying earlier. What is it about One Piece that makes it One Piece? What is it that is necessary to making a authentic One Piece experience? Now, this book does not contain Devil Fruit stat sheets, unique subclasses. I highlight those two specifically because I actually did make subclasses. I made subclasses for each of the Devil Fruit types so that your players could play as them and make rules for them. The reason they're here and the reason they have the asterisk is because they are Devil Fruits. It is hard enough to make rules that encompass all Devil Fruits. It is impossible to include a spell list with that. So there are certain restrictions, there are things you'll have to take into consideration. It is not the same hard and fast rules you would find in an official book, but there are rules, which is why the asterisk is there. Campaign module. This is not a campaign module. This is not a campaign module. I don't think I need to go into details. There are no characters, there are no pre-made characters, there are no pre-made locations. I make references to locations that exist in the series and how you can make locations either of them or based off them, but this is not a module. Cannot stress that enough. And that leads into character NPC monster stat sheets. The reason there's a asterisk next to monster stat sheets is because I do discuss Sea Kings and how I think they should be translated. I do not have a Sea King stat sheet. That's why the asterisk is there. There are no pre-made magic items, there are no pre-made locations. To summarize it all, this is not a campaign module. Cannot stress that enough. This is a guide. I hesitate even to call it a rulebook. It's a guide. I have a very firm philosophy when it comes to Dungeons & Dragons. There are no rules, only suggestions. And especially since this is the beta. So, take everything with a grain of salt, doubt everything, question everything, and make sure I get those questions, because I will answer them to the best of my abilities. Which may not be very good. This is the first time I've done a project of this magnitude. And so I will not guarantee perfection in any shape or form. And this is what I say to you. This book is the starting point, not the finish line. I want us to work together and make a story worth telling. So, without further ado, let's truly get on into Pirates and Power Holders. Table of contents. So, it's divided into, welcome to One Piece, we'll get to. Geography, this is where I focus on the world of One Piece. That's what all of Part 1 is. Part 1 is, here's what you need to know about One Piece. Here's what you need to know. Now, of course, you can find all this information on Wikipedia, online. I have summaries here, and I believe these summaries are sufficient to make an authentic experience, but I would encourage you to use other sources as well. So we go over geography. What is all of this? What does it work? How does it work? Why does it work? We go over factions. Who are the factions? What are the relationships with each other? How are their organizations organized? And then finally, here are the locations that you sort of have to include, that your players will inevitably and unavoidably reference at some point. These are the locations that you really can't afford to cut out, or if you do cut them out, you can't cut them out too far. Be very cautious about it, or at the very least, offer a replacement. Then the little things. As you can see, there's a lot of things to go over, but these are the little details that differentiate One Piece from a pirate campaign. There are lots of pirate campaigns out there, but how do you take that pirate campaign and make it truly One Piece? That's what Chapter 5 is all about. Chapter 2 is about the practicalities. First chapter is dedicated to crew mechanics. It's dedicated to the kind of things that your players will be expecting, or that maybe you as a player would expect to receive, and the general player experience, how that should be treated, how it should be run. The races, all of the races, you can see them there. All of the races, but Giants and Lunarians. Lunarians will be added in time, Giants not so much, as well as any other necessary race. And then finally, translating magic classes there at the end, which is what I imagine a lot of you are probably here for. This is a reminder, the video is marked. So if you go to the timeline of the video, you can see how everything's partitioned out, so you don't need to listen to my voice for ages and ages. Power systems. Devil fruits. How do they work? And this is where I go into the subclasses I mentioned earlier. I flavor the devil fruits, people who use their devil fruits in combat, as sorcerers, and I think that makes sense for reasons I'll go over later. And you can see, all in all, I believe the number is 6 subclasses. Yes, the exact number is 6. 2 Paramecias, 3 Zoans, and 1 Sorcerer. 1 Logia Sorcerer. And then Haki. We go over Haki as a system, as a power system. Finally, navigation. There's your random events table. There's your reference. There's your random events table and a little quick reference table there at the end. So, Chapter 1. The key to this chapter is, what is it that is necessary to creating an authentic One Piece world? And I list them out. So here's what you need to know about One Piece. Those of you who don't know, those of you who need a refresher. First, the Pirate King was executed. And now pirates are running rampant, searching for his treasure. Whether it's 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, it doesn't matter. The point is, the Pirate King was executed. People are looking for his treasure. Second, people understand that the treasure lies at the end of the farthest sea, a place where only a countable few have ever visited and survived. Those of you who are One Piece fans would recognize that as the end of the second half of the Grand Line, called the New World. Third, the One Piece world consists of islands, only islands, and no continents, each with its own culture and climate. There's only one exception to the continent rule, and we'll go over that. 4, this is a fantasy world. It does not have magic, but it does have fantastical elements, which are similar to magic, as well as its own unique magic system. In terms of technology, 5th, the One Piece world has just begun to arrive at the Industrial Revolution. However, keep in mind, each island has its own culture. Some are farther ahead, others are farther behind, and some have unique technologies that don't exist anywhere else. And there are also science fiction elements, though these elements are extremely rare. But all in all, it's right there at the cusp of the Industrial Revolution. You don't quite have cars. You don't have cars, but you do have refrigerators. Surprisingly modern refrigerators, surprisingly modern stoves. And these sort of pseudo-modern appliances are available. But just keep that in mind. If I were to put an exact pinpoint on it, I'd say probably at the turn of the 19th century. It's probably about the point you're looking for. However, some are farther behind, some are medieval, some are futuristic. So just keep all those variables in mind. 6. Devil fruits. This is where we get fun. Devil fruits can be found in the world. Eating one of these awful tasting fruits gives the user unique powers, but also makes it so they can never swim again. It is impossible to eat more than one fruit. We don't know why. Presumably we will find out why eventually, but we don't know why at this time. 7. The world is run by a corrupt world government, and its laws are enforced by the Navy, also called the Marines. Navy and Marines are interchangeable. Don't think Navy and Marines are ever separate entities. If I say Navy or I say Marines, I'm referring to the same group. 8. Most countries are monarchies or autocratic in some way. Democracy is a novel concept. There aren't many of them. 9. At the end of the day, One Piece is a surreal shonen, perhaps one of the most surreal shonen to exist, at least among the more popular ones. Open your mind to strange concepts. It may not seem logical to avoid an attack by cutting a cannonball in half, but in One Piece, that's how it works, especially when your characters get stronger and stronger. So just keep that in mind. Related to that, number 10, do not stray from silly content. I talked before about how I have a tendency towards realism. Let your players be silly. Let your players be silly. It's amusing. As an author, you look at One Piece. Every character in One Piece is a comic relief character. That is not something you have to force on your players, but it needs to be silly. It needs to be fun. Your players need to be having fun. Grimdark doesn't work here, except perhaps in little bits and pieces scattered throughout, but predominantly, it's silly. Let it be silly. But don't be afraid to make things serious when it calls for it. And then finally, One Piece has a lot of themes. It has themes of freedom, themes of friendship, themes of honor, themes of what it means to be a man, what it means to grow up. But there is one theme you cannot dispense with, and that is no man is an island. One of the biggest things in One Piece is learning to depend on other people, learning to work as a group, as a team, and realizing that you can't do anything if you're all alone. That is not a theme you can afford to cut out. The other themes can be switched out and dispensed with in tandem with your player's character arcs, but that is one theme that you cannot dispense with. No man is an island. Without that theme, it's not really a One Piece campaign. So, do not dispense with it. Now we get into geography. Now I am going to blaze through this a bit, because I figure if you really need to know this information, you can look it up, you can read the book yourself. So I'm going to blaze through it. I'm going to focus on this map first. This is the One Piece world, ostensibly. Here in the middle, that's the red line. That is the one continent that exists in the One Piece world. It's exactly what it looks like. It is a red line that cuts the entire world in half. It is a cliff face that juts out of the ocean, reaches up to the sky, and effectively divides the world. The second thing you need to know is this part in the middle, the Grand Line. The Grand Line bisects alongside the red line, cuts the world into 4 pieces: the North Blue, the East Blue, the South Blue, and the West Blue. The 4 blues, as they're collectively called, are effectively normal. They are effectively normal. There isn't much in the way of fantasy here. There really isn't. They tend to be pretty normative and follow all the rules that I was going over earlier. In the 4 blues, non-human races, so any race other than human, is considered mythical. They really just do not exist in the 4 blues. The 4 blues are almost purely human-dominated. You will not encounter many non-human races, with the perhaps exception of fishmen, because fishmen, of course, they're fish. Fishmen. They can swim. and so the constraints of the Grand Line don't really apply to them, and because of that, they're a lot more mobile than the other races and permeate the world a lot more deeply than the other non-human races. But non-human races are generally considered mythical. They're generally considered to not exist. Devil fruits are the same. Devil fruits are considered largely mythical, because these islands, these island communities, are effectively isolated, and so anything that exists beyond their community is foreign. Because, as I said, islands. They are all islands. They're all separated from one another. They are connected by a network of marines. They're connected by newspapers. But generally speaking, devil fruits are mythical. Devil fruits aren't talked about. The only people who know about devil fruits in the Four Blues are people who have encountered devil fruits themselves, which is to say, not very many people. The way the Grand Line and the New World, which is the second half of the Grand Line, separates the world is through the calm belt, which is the two faded blue lines on either side. If you remember what I was talking about earlier, with One Piece being pre-industrial, there are only sailboats. There are only sailboats, with the exception of extremely intelligent individuals who have crafted futuristic modes of transportation for themselves. There are only sailboats, and the calm belt, as it sounds, is an area of sea with no wind, meaning that sailboats cannot cross it. Sailboats can't cross it. It's also a nest for sea monsters. So not only can you not escape the calm belt once you've sailed into it, but you're also going to be devoured. I would encourage you to look up reference images of sea kings, because they can be as small as a fishing boat and as large as, well, as large as a skyscraper, I suppose. I'm not sure there's any other place for comparison. So it's massive. The last thing I'll say before moving on is I do want you to remember this map. It's important because you want to keep your world consistent. If you have, let's say you start your characters in the East Blue, and your characters encounter someone from the North Blue, how did they get to the East Blue? That is an important question. If they're from the South Blue, even more so. If they're from the West Blue, even more so. How did they get there? And that's one of the things we were talking about before. There's not a lot of cross-pollination between the four blues. And so when you do cross-pollinate, be mindful. Be mindful that it makes sense. Be mindful that the characters, or even the players, if they want to be from a different ocean, have a reason to be there. So, we move on. The Four Corner Seas, as mentioned before, are very similar to our world. Other than the fact that they're made of islands. They're very similar to our world. There is not a lot of diversity, both in terms of the races, but also in terms of the cultures. The North Blue tends to be very cold. The South Blue is very tropical. The East and West Blues are temperate. And so, while there is room for variation there, just keep that in mind. There's not as much variation as you'd find elsewhere. There's not a lot of diversity. Keep that in mind. The Grand Line. The Grand Line is very special. Because while the Four Blues are very much like our world, the Grand Line is very much not. The Grand Line is very much not like our world. I dare say it is impossibly different, and the mechanisms of the Grand Line largely contribute to what makes One Piece unique. You see, in the Grand Line, compasses don't work. That's where it starts off. Compasses don't work, so how do you navigate? Well, for whatever reason, the Earth's magnetic field is very, very wonky in the Grand Line. So wonky that each island has its own magnetic pole, and it can only be navigated by log poses. Log poses are compasses that point to the next island, and islands form effectively what is a path across the Grand Line. A straight path across the Grand Line where you go from one island to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next, until you reach the end of the Grand Line. And that's how the log poses work. And that's also important to keep in mind, because when your players leave the 4 blues and into the Grand Line, you as the DM, as the Dungeon Master, will have a lot more control over where they go. You'll have a lot more control over where they go. You have what is effectively a natural railroading mechanism, and the reason I point that out is to not take advantage of it. Do not take advantage of it. When your players enter the Grand Line, it's a tumultuous sea, it is a chaotic sea, and because of that, they will not have as many options as they did before. Keep that in mind, be mindful of that. And that leads me into the Grand Line is a goddamn mess. Each island in the Grand Line has its own seasonal patterns. Some islands are stuck in eternal winter, some islands are in eternal summer. Some islands flip rapidly through the seasons, while others may stick in seasons for years on end. That is to say, islands in the Grand Line are weird. If you remember what I was saying before, the 4 blues are very much like our world. That is not true in the Grand Line. In fact, when making islands for the Grand Line, it is not inappropriate to treat each island as its own independent universe, its own world in of itself, because islands have their own rules. Islands have their own rules that don't make sense. They have a lot more unique flora and fauna. They have landscapes that defy imagination, sometimes defy gravity. They have bubbles that grow from the earth and don't pop. They have... There's an island where it's always day. The Grand Line is tumultuous. And if you want an idea of how tumultuous, I would recommend looking in the random events table. There's a reason why the Grand Line is called the Pirate's Graveyard. It is rocked by storms of horrific, nonsensical weather. And your players will have to deal with that. So that's the Grand Line. Go over this a bit. If you remember what I said before, in the 4 blues, devil fruits and non-human races are considered mythical. They're not considered to exist for most people. That is not true in the Grand Line. In the Grand Line, devil fruits, non-human races are a fact of life. Now, that doesn't mean they don't face discrimination or that they would not receive odd looks, because they're still uncommon. They're still rare, but they're not mythical. They're not mythical. That's important. Eternal poses are like log poses. They allow you to travel to a very specific island rather than the next island in a string of islands. And so that's how your players would reach locations that would be otherwise outside the normal path, off the beaten path, let's say. The final major thing, and this is to keep in mind when making cultures, when making Grand Line islands and cultures, is that pirates are normal. In the 4 blues, pirates are aberrant. They are largely weak. They're largely controlled by the Marines, by the government. However, because the Grand Line Sea is so chaotic, the world government doesn't have as much jurisdiction there, and so pirates run free. And on top of that, the vast, vast majority of sailors who go to the Grand Line in the first place are pirates themselves, because they have to go to the Grand Line in order to claim the treasure of the Pirate King. Going to the Grand Line is how you make a name for yourself, and so that's what pirates do. Because of that, cultures on the Grand Line are actually far more amicable to pirates in the 4 blues than in the 4 blues. Some have their own policies, some openly welcome pirates. As long as the pirates don't pillage, they're just tourists. And that's the attitude a lot of Grand Line islands take. So when making Grand Line islands, making Grand Line cultures, keep in mind. Keep in mind that largely The only people who visit these islands are pirates, sometimes for better and sometimes for worse. And I suppose we ought to mention challenge ratings. The way I see it, your players should probably be entering the Grand Line from the 4 blues around levels 3 to 5. The 4 blues is largely the tutorial zone. It's World 1. And the bulk of the story ought to take place in the Grand Line. That's how I see it. So if you're running a long-term campaign, I'd recommend exiting around level 5. Certainly not after level 6. Calm Belt, we mentioned this before, but because I talked about the Calm Belt before, let's talk about Reverse Mountain. So, you may have noticed this odd little formation on the map. That's Reverse Mountain. Reverse Mountain is a mountain, that's the name, in the center of the red line. And what this mountain does is you can see it has rivers that connect all 4 blues. However, these rivers flow up the mountain and then dump all that water in the Grand Line. That's how ships get in there. You can find clips of the Straw Hats making this journey online for reference. I'd recommend citing those. Anyway, we move on to the New World. The New World is the second half of the Grand Line. And there are 2 important things you need to know. The first is that everything I said about the Grand Line, about it being weird and wacky, go ahead and kick that up to 11. The New World is actually insane. We are talking currents that flow up and out of the water. We are talking about hail the size of school buses. We are talking about snow made of cotton candy. The New World has no logic. The 4 blues follow conventional logic. The Grand Line is constantly abstracting logic, but never quite breaks it. The New World just openly violates logic. It doesn't make sense. Don't expect it to make sense. The second big thing about the New World, the second half of the Grand Line, is that it is ruled by pirate emperors. Do you remember how I said before that the Marines didn't have as much jurisdiction over the Grand Line because the Grand Line is so chaotic and tumultuous? That is even more true of the New World. The New World is borderline impassable. The Marines have no jurisdiction, and so the acting governments are emperors, criminal emperors, pirate emperors, and their large, extensive, military-sized crews. These emperors have ruled the Grand Line because there's no one to oppose them except each other, and all effectively clamor for the treasure of the Pirate King in their own ways. Finally is the Sky Islands, and this is where we get a little bit more fun. To summarize the Sky Islands, have you ever thought about standing on a cloud or sailing a boat across the clouds? That's what Sky Islands are. Sky Islands are civilizations that exist in the clouds. They are divided into 4 levels, which is the White Sea, which is a sea of clouds with the properties of water. Island clouds, which are islands with the property of earth, with the property of solidity. The White Sea, which is a second layer of water clouds above the first. And then more islands. The Sky Islands are not a necessary aspect of your world, but they are an extra dimension that you can add. Maybe you want to do a Sky Pirate campaign, and that is entirely doable. And your players can reach the Sky Islands through 2 means, either the knock-up stream, which is a burst of water, basically a geyser that forms in the middle of the ocean and pushes ships up into the stratosphere, and the summit of High West, which has been discussed but never actually shown. So, that is to say, make it up yourself. The only thing else to note about Sky Islands is that they have their own technology called dial technology, which is technology made from seashells and allows you to store and then release various objects. Tone dials are also the One Piece equivalent of CDs and records, so keep that in mind. Islands. I do want to stress this out, because I mentioned this before, but it is true. Each island is unique. Some islands are basically a rock in the middle of the ocean and nothing more. Other islands are extremely large. Alabasta, for instance. Alabasta is an island with no less than 5 major cities, each of which is a day's travel apart. That's pretty major. Alabasta is huge. And on top of that, because these cultures are all isolated from one another, there is no overarching culture. Some cultures are very obviously Egyptian, some can be Greek, some can be Italian, some can be wholly unique. But that uniqueness is what I want to stress. If you remember earlier, I said each island ought to be treated as its own universe, and I meant that. Each island has its own rules, its own logic, its own cultures, its own communities, and I would encourage you as the game master to flesh that out and make each location truly unique from the others. So let's talk about factions. These are the various groups that are competing for power and attention in One Piece and in your One Piece world. Of course, first are pirates. Pirates are pirates. They're criminals. Seafaring criminals that live in defiance of the world government. They fly a Jolly Roger, which is a unique symbol, unique to each individual crew. They rob, they pillage, they're pirates. However, it's important to remember that there are 2 core values to pirates, which is freedom and individuality. Pirates are unique. Each crew is unique. Each crew has their own dynamics, their own characters. And it's important to remember what I talked about before. The government is tyrannical. And when a government becomes tyrannical, then good men become criminals. So while pirates inevitably lean towards evil and neutral alignments, there are good pirates because the government is not good. And so good men become pirates, they become criminals. And I imagine your players will likely be among them. Pirates are selfish, they're often arrogant, but ultimately each pirate crew is entirely unique. So it's difficult to apply firm rules. Other than that, they are criminals, they are enemies of the government, and they have a Jolly Roger. As NPCs, they're generally divided into the captain, which is, of course, the captain, the commanders, which is just a polite term for the named, the named NPCs of the crew, the second, third, and fourth in command, and then, of course, all the other members of the crew who are nameless foot soldiers and aren't worth anything. Then we have bounty hunters. Bounty hunters aren't explored too much in One Piece, but they do exist. They are there. Pirates are criminals. The world government puts bounties on them for their capture, and bounty hunters are the people who go after those bounties. I do want to focus on bounty hunters a bit, because bounty hunters are unique in that they offer an alternative. One Piece is about pirates, and so people expect if you play a One Piece campaign, you're going to play as pirates. However, bounty hunters offer a workable alternative. Bounty hunters offer their own sort of campaign. You can do a bounty hunter campaign, which is why bounty hunters are unique. They're usually motivated by wealth or sometimes justice, and they tend towards the neutral alignments. There are different bounty hunter guilds scattered, and each has their own insignia, not unlike a Jolly Roger. Sometimes the insignia is tattooed, sometimes the insignia is flown on a flag, but bounty hunters tend to be lone wolves. They tend to travel by themselves or in a group of 2 or 3, usually rarely more than that. Rarely ever more than that. And so guilds are how bounty hunters collectivize their strength. And you know what guilds are. You know what guilds are. Bounty hunters effectively have permission to almost act as pirates, because they're free to rob and to pillage so long as they're robbing and pillaging from pirates. However, if you do decide to go down the route of a bounty hunter campaign, there is a unique problem that will be addressed, which is that the more powerful bounty hunters individuals become, the more interested the government will be. With a bounty hunter campaign, your players would eventually be forced to either become abject pirates or to become servants of the world government, because the world government does not take kindly to powerful individuals who are unchecked. There is an alternative to this, because, of course, in the New World, if you remember, there's no laws. The New World is wild and rambunctious, and there's no real order. And so it has both positives and negatives for bounty hunters. It's a big negative because they're less safe, but it's a big positive because they don't have to worry about the government. So, that is to say, bounty hunters are very special, and they will likely show up at various points as antagonists for your characters if your characters are pirates. They aren't used terribly often, and they aren't terribly important, but they are an aspect of the world which ought not be forgotten. Here's where we get interesting. The world government. I hope you all are politics buffs. The world government is the government of the world. There are over 170 member nations, and they meet every 4 years in an event called the Reverie to essentially draft legislation that affects the whole world. The flag consists of 5 connected circles that shape a plus sign, and these flags are displayed in all world government and even navy facilities and ships. The decisions made at Reverie are final, but the Reverie meets every 4 years, so who governs the world in the meantime? Well, that would be the Celestial Dragons, also called the World Nobles. The World Nobles are the descendants of the 20 kings that originally formed the world government, and they are nobles. They live high and mighty in the land of Merijois, and 5 of them, the 5 Elder Stars, are responsible for drafting the legislation and making the decisions that govern the world between reveries. More secretly, there's also a king. We don't know anything about the king except that there is one, and that he holds power over even the 5 Elder Stars. He's secret. Nobody knows about him. Nobody. Nobody. He's kept hidden to maintain the appearance of democracy, or at least of oligarchy. But that facade is just that. It's a facade. A facade slowly uncovered over time. There's also the Cypherpole, which is a direct arm of the world government. If you remember, the Navy is an arm of the world government, but they are technically a separate organization. Cypherpole, not so much. Cypherpole work directly under the world government. They are effectively the FBI, the CIA, and basically any other spy organization that you can think of. They are divided into 10 organizations. CP1 through CP8 are public organizations. They go undercover, but generally speaking, CP1 through 8 are bureaucrats. When you're talking about CP4 plus, that's when you're getting into people who actually go out, go undercover, do field work, but they handle a lot of bureaucracy, they handle a lot of low-level crime, low-level monitoring. It's only when you get into CP7 and 8 that you get deep undercover. And then you have CP9. CP9 is secret. Nobody knows about it. If you remember, CP7 and 8 go deep undercover. CP9 does as well, but they go far, far deeper, sometimes for years at a time. And not only are they undercover agents, they are assassins. They make people disappear. And they are very, very good at it. They are not to be trifled with, but nobody, again, nobody knows they exist. The people who do know that they exist often find themselves 6 feet underground. Finally, there's CP Aegis 0. CP Aegis 0 is not hidden, it's not secret, but it isn't widely known about. Mostly because it doesn't bother most people. It's not important for most people. The identities of CP Aegis 0 agents are hidden, and even the agents themselves often disguise themselves with masks. However, it's not clear what precisely their job is. We know that they, like the world nobles, live on Marijoa, and ostensibly they are the shield of the Celestial Dragons. They protect the Celestial Dragons. However, they do often go out into the world and interfere, go undercover. But generally speaking, they act as the direct arm of the world nobles specifically. They do whatever it is that the world nobles require them to do, whether that be field work, whether that be protecting them. It seems that that is what their purpose is. The government's main goal is to gain and maintain power. Those who are higher up in the organization tend towards the lawful and evil alignments. However, the lower levels of the organizations, they're just trying to stop crime, they're just trying to do their jobs, and they tend towards the good alignments. And that dichotomy is something absolutely worth exploring. Celestial Dragons, they live on top of the red line in Marijoa. That's what Marijoa is, it's on top of the red line. Most of the important details have already been covered, except for two things. First, their word is absolute. Absolutely absolute. They cannot be defied. They cannot be defied, and the entire Navy, and I do mean the entire Navy, moves to their will. The only reason they don't use that power is because, frankly, they're stupid and infantile. And if you look down here, physically pathetic. They are effectively commoners in terms of their stats, in terms of their combat abilities. But if you attack one, a Navy Admiral, which is one of the highest ranks that can be attained, the second highest rank to be exact, will show up to take your head. Thankfully, as alluded to before, they don't wield their power too much, mostly because they rarely ever leave Marijoa. They rarely ever leave their home on top of the Grand Line, because that's how much they hate the common folk. That's how much they hate the common folk and how much they love, literally, being above everyone else. The other small detail is that they wear bubbles around their head, or domes, to be more specific. Yes, it is glass. That filter the air, so they don't have to breathe the air of the common folk. That's important. The other detail is that they hold slaves. Slavery has been officially outlawed by the world government, but as I said before, the world nobles can do whatever they please. That includes owning slaves. They especially like mermaid slaves, for reasons that are obvious but ought not be discussed. They tend towards chaotic and evil because they are infantile, selfish, and cruel. The opposite of infantile, selfish, and cruel are the Marines. They are the law enforcement. They are an arm of the world government, and they do operate under the world government. However, they have their own structure. They are a significantly unique organization. They are under the government, but they are not the government, I think is the best way to describe it. The main things you need to know is that there are patrol officers, infantry divisions, which travel around the sea and are generally not very powerful. And then there are commissioned officers, which are more powerful officers deployed to handle certain threats and to protect Navy bases. The general hierarchy goes as such. You have the seamen, which are the foot soldiers, the captain, which are leaders of marine bases in the 4 blues, lieutenants, which are commissioned officers, mostly in the blues, commodores, which are commissioned officers in the Grand Line, rear admirals, which are commissioned officers, again in the Grand Line, and they are very powerful, vice admirals. I keep saying admirals, I apologize. Vice admirals are very, very powerful. They are the top of their class. They're found in the Grand Line and the New World. Even though the Navy does not have much jurisdiction in the New World, when it does go to the New World, it is often on the ships of vice admirals. That's how powerful they are. They're often dubbed for users as well. Then you have the admirals. The admirals are the highest ranked commissioned officer, only under the fleet admiral himself. There are only ever 3. They're almost always dubbed for users, and they only appear under specific circumstances. They only ever handle existential threats. However, because they're so high ranked, they generally have the freedom to do as they please, unless directly ordered by, say, a celestial dragon. They also have a title, which consists of a color and an animal: Aokiji, blue pheasant; Aka-inu, red dog; Kizaru, yellow monkey; Fujitora, purple tiger, etc. Finally, you have the fleet admiral, which is the leader of the Marines. They're usually promoted from admiral, they're usually devil fruit eater, they are extremely powerful, though how powerful, uncertain. Thankfully, they almost always remain at Marine HQ. They almost never leave because they are in charge of maintaining Navy presence across the entire globe. Needless to say, they are very busy. The warlords. Warlords are pretty simple. Allow me to explain. Warlords are pirates that have been bought off by the government. They were once famous, powerful pirates, and they still are, and they are pirates. However, they have their own unique classification because they have been pardoned, not quite pardoned, but let's say pardoned for the sake of simplicity, by the government in exchange for services. What warlords do is they populate the Grand Line, and they kill newbies. There's no simpler way to put it. They kill newbies. It is their job to find up-and-coming pirates and remove them, shall we say. To unalive them. They have free range to pillage as they please, so long as they only target other pirates. They have full permission to do so, unless and until they cross the government, in which case their pardon will be revoked and they will become mere pirates once more. Warlords of the Sea are not strictly necessary to your One Piece world, however, they do play a major role in the story, and I dare to suggest that you would probably feel incomplete without their presence. The other major thing about them is that they have a wide range of powers. If you look here, challenge rating 8 to 18. The most powerful of the warlords can tangle with admirals. However, the weakest can be handled by vice admirals. They cover a wide range of abilities, and there are various reasons why someone might become a warlord, from politics to selfishness to personal protection. So keep those reasons in mind as you craft your world. Now we move on to the emperors. The emperors are unique in that they're very nearly either the most important aspect of the One Piece world or the least important. Least important because your players will not be dealing with them until the late stages of the story. The late stages of the campaign. Because the Emperors of the Sea are powerful. They are the most powerful individuals in the world. And that's what keys them into being the most important. Because their influence is nearly as wide as the navies, not in the 4 blues, but in the Grand Line. They have impossible reach and are able to perform feats that would be impossible for any individual crew, because these are not mere pirate crews. These are criminal militaries. Dare I say, criminal empires. And unlike, say, the criminal empires of the modern world, which has to remain in the shadows, they are out in the open, because they are too powerful for the Navy to oppose, or at least to oppose alone. I think the best way to illustrate this is just to look at the dynamics. You have the fodder, which is of course the foot soldiers, we don't worry about them. But then you have the headliners. Headliners are most often previous pirates, pirate crews that went to the Grand Line, specifically the New World, the second half of the Grand Line, and were defeated and forced into servitude. That's the chief difference between Emperors of the Sea, and also called Yonko, that's important, between the Emperors of the Sea and the Warlords. The Warlords kill their opposition. The Emperors recruit them. Because these are nations, these are empires, and as empires, they naturally desire to expand their influence. So headliners are the officers. They're people who go out and do things on behalf of the emperor. They are the emperor's representatives abroad. They are wardens. They are directors. They tend to be fairly important in the hierarchy, but only relative to the people beneath them. Officers are much the same, except they are above the headliners. They are far and above more powerful and have far more important tasks. And then you have the commanders. So generally speaking, emperors have 3 commanders, some have 4, some may have 5, especially if you're looking to have the number of commanders match your player characters, which is feasible and even perhaps recommended, at least for the major villains. But you have the 3rd commander who deals with extremely important tasks, but is, for all intents and purposes, basically a glorified officer. You have the 2nd strongest crew member who is crucial. They are not quite the ace in the hole, but they are an important resource which the Emperor does not expend flippantly. The 1st commander even more so. They are the most powerful member of the crew, other than the Emperor. They rarely ever leave the Emperor's side, and in fact, getting the 1st commander away from the Emperor is far and above the most important task in the fight against the Emperor. The Emperor themselves, who's approximately as strong as a Tarrasque. That is the level I put these Emperors at. They cannot be dealt with lightly. They cannot be dealt with flippantly. These are the final boss. These people control the entire New World. It is survival of the fittest, and these emperors have shown themselves as being the fittest. It is enough work for your players to take out a single emperor, much less several. They are not to be handled lightly. Related to that, when your players do enter the New World, it is highly likely that they may end up, if only for a period of time, under the service of an emperor, because that's what emperors do. Emperors recruit. Rather than warlords who are focused on maintaining their power, emperors are focused on growing their power. There's usually 4 of them, and they're constantly infighting, though that infighting rarely evolves into full-scale war. The other thing to note is that they are pirates, and they follow the same rules as pirates. They are individuals, they are free, they have crew and camaraderie dynamics, and all of that remains the true, except it's just on a much larger scale. You also have to keep in mind that there are ostensibly 4 emperors. You can have more, you can have less, but it tends to hover around 4, hence the name Yonko. Yon 4, co-emperor. So, they are the most major threat, but they're also background figures. For most of the story, they exist only in the background and will not be important to your players. So, there's something that you need to worry very much about, but also, you don't have to worry about it much at all. because they aren't going to be getting involved in your story for a very, very long time. Unless, of course, you want them to. The Revolutionary Army. The Revolutionary Army are rebels. They are not pirates, but they are criminals, and they are criminals that specifically oppose the world government. They are an organized rebellion dedicated to freeing various countries, various islands from the tyranny of the world government and eventually overthrowing them. In a lot of ways, they're mirrors to Cypherpole in that they often go undercover, they exist in the shadows, and their greatest strength is not being discovered, because they do not have the military power that the world government does. They do not have the military power that even the Yonkos do. They are largely an underground organization, and that is both their greatest strength and their greatest weakness. Even so, they tend towards lawful good. Here we have a breakdown of all the information I went over, the general recommended challenge ratings in the different oceans. You can go that in your own time. I don't think it's very, very important. We went over all the basic things. All you really need to remember is that warlords are weird and emperors are Tarasques. So, what do you need to include in terms of locations? we'll rush through this. Logtown, that's only if you're in the East Blue. Logtown is the last island before you go to the Grand Line. It's a tourist stop, and the Navy takes full advantage of the fact that it's the last island before the Grand Line to try and catch pirates. That's all you need to know. It's not even a strictly necessary location, except that it's also where the Pirate King was executed, but these are minor details. You can wreck on them as you please. Reverse Mountain, we went over Reverse Mountain. Don't worry about it too much. Crocus's Lighthouse, there's a lighthouse at the entrance to the Grand Line on the other side in the Grand Line, but it's not strictly necessary that you include it. However, I would recommend putting something there. Marine Ford, Marine HQ. It's at the end of the Grand Line, next to Saboti Archipelago and Marie-Joie, but it is an island. It is an island. It isn't on the sea below Marie-Joie. Speaking of which, Saboti Archipelago, like Logtown, it is the final island of the Grand Line before you go to the New World. There is a relatively substantial Navy presence there because Marine Ford, again, it's not far away. But that's really all you need to know. I'd recommend just look it up. Go to Wikipedia, look it up, you'll find what you need to know. Holy Land Marie-Joie, we went over that. The Holy Land Marie-Joie is above the Grand Line. It's where the Celestial Dragons live. Fishman Island is where the fishmen live. It is actually underneath the Grand Line, underneath Marie-Joie. It's at the furthest reach of the ocean, the bottom of the ocean, and it has light down there because of the grace of the Eve tree, which transmits light to the bottom of the ocean. It's built in bubbles which contain air. Look it up. Zo, that's where the minks are from, which we'll go over in the races chapter. Notably, it is a giant elephant with an island on its back. Again, I recommend looking it up for yourself. Greenbit, it's where the Tentadas are from. It's next to Dressrosa. Tentadas don't leave very often, so nearly every Tentada in the world is originally from Greenbit. Same with Zo. Minks don't leave Zo very often. So, in fact, I'd even say the same with Fishman Island. Most fishermen in the world come from Fishman Island because it's where they're safe. It's where they're accepted, where they know they'll be accepted. Laughtail, Raftel. It is the island where the Pirate King's treasure is. No one knows how to get there, except that it's at the end of the New World. Roadstar is similar to Saboti Archipelago. It is the final island of the Grand Line, specifically the final island of the New World. We don't know anything about it other than that. Anyway, the other notable thing is that there's no known exit to the New World. We know how you get into the New World. You get in through Reverse Mountain, but it's not known how you get out. So you just kind of have to make something up. And now the little things. First is currency. So, of course, they don't have gold. They have berries. That's the name of the currency, symbolized with a B. Of course, there's two lines there, but that symbol doesn't really exist. The other thing to note about berries is that berries are equivalent to Japanese yen. It's the exact same currency. And if you divide that by 100, you get the price in American dollars. It's a little hard to translate, but I did the best I could. A copper piece is 10 berries, a silver piece is 100 berries, an electrum piece, even though nobody uses electrum, is 500 berries. A gold piece is 1,000 berries, and a platinum piece is 10,000 berries. Feel free to alter it. If you know more about the D&D economy than I do, feel free to alter that. But that's as I understand it. Biology as technology. I've mentioned at various points about unique fauna, unique animals. There's nothing more unique than the transponder snail. Transponder snails are living telephones. They are snails with psychic powers that allow them to communicate with other snails. And through that connection, you can establish telephone lines and communication networks, and your players can buy them, although there are limits, but you can buy personal transponder snails, mini snails, that you can tuck in your pocket and communicate between. The boss snails and snails are for walkie-talkie networks. Black snails allows you to intercept communications. Horned snails allow you to block communications. You can also get snails that function as fax machines, projectors, cameras, loudspeakers, just about any communication, visual or auditory, that you can imagine. News coups. These are large seagulls, I believe they're technically albatross, that deliver newspapers. The newspapers are run by the World Economic Journal. It is a branch of the world government, so it is corrupt, but they deliver news everywhere, even to pirate ships, so your players will be getting news, and it's also how they'll get their bounty posters. Related to the unique fauna I was mentioning before, a good way to make islands feel unique is to add unique mounts. Societies are largely defined by their means of transportation, and so altering the means of transportation will grant your islands a unique feel. Potions. Here it is. One thing to note is that potions don't really exist. However, there are drugs, there are chemical concoctions that would function in the same way. However, what I would do is I would make these more potent, or maybe as potent as their D&D counterparts, but try to incorporate some sort of demerit, because that tends to be a running theme. But I replace health potions with first aid kits, no surprise there. A normal potion of healing is a small first aid kit. A greater healing is a survivor's first aid kit. Superior healing, doctor's first aid kit. Supreme healing, surgeon's first aid kit. It's all the same. The names are different. Don't worry about it. Bounties and epithets. So all pirates, all of them, have a bounty and an epithet. Even Marines will have epithets if they're famous enough. And I go through the various formats, but for those who aren't aware, an epithet is just a title. So Straw Hat Luffy, Straw Hat is his epithet. Cat Burglar Nami, Cat Burglar is her epithet. Pirate Hunter Zoro, Pirate Hunter is his epithet. But you have different ways you can format. Shiryu of the Rain, Kaido, King of Beasts, stuff like that. Go over some average bounties. In the 4 blues, the average bounty for pirates is 10 million, and never more than 30 million. If a pirate's bounty exceeds 30 million, they're usually on their way to the Grand Line. The highest recorded bounty, if I remember correctly, for a pirate in the East Blue is about 55 million, and it's almost never higher than that. In the Grand Line, only the top of the top of the top get to 100 million. Most of them are between 50 million and 100 million. However, the most powerful pirates in the Grand Line can reach even 300 million, so keep an eye on that. Emperors have bounties exceeding 3 billion. Their commanders are usually between 500 million and 2 billion, and their officers are between 100 and 500 million. You can read all this yourself. These are relatively important details to keep in mind because they help you to flesh out your world, but they are minor details, and if we're being honest, One Piece isn't overly consistent about bounties, so you don't need to feel overly bound by them either. Devil fruits are named exactly as so. 2, it's a word, and then a fruit. The word itself is never longer than 2 syllables. The gomu gomu, bari bari, bara bara. In the cases where the word that is being referenced is longer than 2 syllables, it's usually shortened. It usually ends in a vowel sound, but not always. However, the names are usually pretty vague and abstract. Even, especially for Paramecias, it's not illogical to suggest that the word is their power, and that they have that concept, the power that surrounds that concept. And there's a unique naming system for Zoan fruits, which let you turn to animals, which has the family, and then the species. So an example, cat fruit, model leopard, dog fruit, model dachshund, ox fruit, model bison, etc. Magic. Let's talk about magic. Magic doesn't exist, but what we do have is willpower, which is vaguely reminiscent of magic. It allows you to create blessed items, it allows you to create cursed items, which would act as your magic items. If you have a powerful will, you have the ability to inflict that will on your environment. Take that as you will. The way that it impacts the environment is usually very subtle, but that doesn't mean it's not there. Sea Kings. So this is what I was talking about before about creatures. What I recommend for Sea Kings is to take dragon stats, subtract the AC by 2, because Sea Kings have supple meat. They don't have scales. And, sorry, by 3, I have it written here. Remove the breath and claw attacks, as well as damage resistances. And I'd also recommend maybe adding a swallow attack, if they're big enough. The other big thing is that Sea King meat is a delicacy. If your players can kill a Sea King and take the meat, then they can make a lot of money, and they can make a lot of food. Lots of good food as well. But keep track of the ferry weight. Your ship's carry weight, sorry. Because this is a lot of meat. It's a lot of meat. So, just be clear. Making islands unique, we talked about this a bit earlier. Make your islands unique. Each one should be unique from the rest. Easy way to do this is with monsters, fauna. Remnants of the Pirate King's crew. The Pirate King is dead, but that doesn't mean his crew is dead. Various members of his crew can be found scattered across the globe, which can be allies or enemies. The Will of D. This is fun. There are a chosen group of people in the world who have D as a middle initial. Monkey D. Luffy. Rox D. Zebek. Jaguar D. Saul. No one knows what the D stands for, except that those with the D initial are called collectively as the D Clan and are considered to be the sworn enemies of God. For whatever reason, the world government hates them and wants to see them either subjugated or eradicated. It's not known why. But it is believed that it is responsible. The D Clan emerges from Joy Boy, who lived during the Void Century, which is a period of time for which there is no recorded history. The study of the Void Century is illegal, punishable by death, and we do not know anything about Joy Boy, except that he is Joy Boy. But he is considered to be likely connected to the Will of D in some way. We don't know exactly how. Void Century, just talked about this. 900 years ago, there's a century with no recorded history. We have no idea what happened, except that at the end of it, the world government was created. That's all we know about it. Investigating it is illegal. You will be killed. In fact, the government will execute all means at its disposal to keep the information secret. Poneglyphs. Around the One Piece world, there are giant stone blocks. These blocks are indestructible, absolutely indestructible. And inscribed on it is a nearly unreadable script. unreadable because all of the people who can translate the script have been killed by the world government. On these poneglyphs are secret information, pointing to the true facts of the voice entry and to the existence of ancient weapons. 3 powerful weapons named for gods, who have the power to shake the world in their own unique ways. There are also 4 red, also called road poneglyphs, that have to be translated in order to reach Laftel. So, keep an eye out for those. Lineage factor, this is simple. Lineage factor is DNA, but is unique in that lineage factor is more malleable than our DNA. It is more malleable in every way, shape, and form, including racial genetics. This is a relatively simple idea that's hard to put into words. So fishmen and merfolk. There are fishmen for different types of fish, there are merfolk for different types of fish. However, whenever 2 fishmen or 2 merfolk, or even a fishman and a merfolk have a child, the exact species of fish is not taken into consideration. So that means a shark fishman and a pufferfish mermaid can have an octopus fishman child, and that is perfectly normal. And the same is true of minks. The exact specific type of mink does not matter. The exact type of fishman does not matter, because all of the fish genetics, let's say, all of the animal genetics are included in the fishman genome. There are also half-breeds, usually with humans, half giant, half fishman. There's also wotans, which are giants and fishmen. They aren't really covered much in the source material. Maybe you want to use them more. Language. There's only one spoken language in the One Piece world, other than ancient languages, whose study is either forbidden or just discouraged. Religion. This is interesting. There is Christianity in the One Piece world. There is. There's Bibles. However, there is no organized religion. There are cults, because of course there are cults, but there are no churches. There are no obvious monasteries. And generally speaking, the One Piece world can be described as spiritual but not religious. People have their own beliefs about whether or not there is a god, who that god is, but there is no organized religion. Why that is can only be left to imagination. It might be Oda's own tendencies, it might be perhaps religion is outlawed. Perhaps organized religion is outlawed, we don't know. People have their own beliefs, there are Bibles, but there aren't churches, or at least there are not active churches that we see. Generally, there are theists, Christian theists, agnostics, atheists, and Buddhists, and they tend to be translated pretty exactly. How the story of Christ translates to a One Piece world, translates to the One Piece world, can only be guessed at, but there are no obvious differences. But that is important, is that God and Satan are well-known concepts, which everyone understands. There's also a fairly common superstition about the existence of a sea god and a sea devil, which is used to explain devil fruits, but it seems to be superstition, some sort of cultural carryover from a previous age. Depth and altitude, that doesn't matter. Basically, depth and altitude don't seem to matter. You can breathe in space, and you can be at the bottom of the ocean without the pressure crushing you. The pressure does exist, but it's not important. One Piece, we don't know what it is. Make it up. So now we're finished summarizing 25 years of world building. Let's move on to the game. The actual game. So, go over the practicalities of a life at sea. This is where what I mentioned at the start of the video comes into play. I'm a realist, and so I tend to be kind of a hard ass when it comes to things like this. The characters will need to buy meals. There are poor meals, there are modest meals, comfortable, wealthy, and aristocratic. And because it's a pirate campaign, I wanted to incorporate scurvy, so your players can get scurvy. If they eat nothing but poor meals for 5 days, they have to make a con saving throw of a DC of 12, repeating the saving throw if they succeed for every day that they do not eat a comfortable meal or higher. They will get scurvy, which is the same as exhaustion, until they eat, again, a meal of comfortable quality or higher. Wealthy meals add a +4 when rolling hit dice. On a short rest, that is not a +4 to each dice, it is a +4 overall. While aristocratic meals, when eaten on a short rest, give characters advantage when rolling hit dice. Again, you roll all dice twice, not each individually, and you take the higher number. And there's another table in the quick reference chapter. To put off starvation, players and NPCs without a roll, we'll go over rolls in a minute, can fish. Fishing, you need a fishing tackle, you make a survival check, and then you divide the result by 8, and that's how many meals you got. Meals are modest by default. They are modest, so while they will not add to scurvy, but they will also not cure scurvy. So take that into consideration. They roll once per day, divide the result by 8. On a critical success, they will pull in a large fish, which is equivalent to 20 comfortable meals, and on a fail, the tackle breaks. Your players will also have to worry about acquiring cannonballs and boards for repairs, because their ship can get damaged, and when it's damaged, it will need to be repaired. As I understand it, it's 15,000 for a day's repairs, but 15,000 berries for a day's repairs in a port. However, that price would naturally change based on how much damage was actually done, and also where they are, and who they are. This isn't even to mention other things. The point is, make sure your players have money. Make sure your players have money, because this is not a normal D&D campaign where whenever the players are short on funds, they can just go over to the nearest adventuring guild and take odd jobs. They can't do that. So it's a bit more important for you as the dungeon master to provide them with an income. So just keep that in mind. The ship. The short of it, I would recommend you start players off with a keelboat. You can find those for free online. Didn't include them for obvious reasons. I'd recommend you use keelboat stats, and I'd also recommend you take a session 0. You might need a session 0.1 and the 0.2 to actually design the ship, because your players will be spending a lot of time on the ship, because I mentioned before, I wanted to authenticate and expand on travel. So your players will be spending a lot of time on the ship, and you also want your players to be a bit more attached. So maybe take the time to customize the ship, and don't be surprised if they ask for some weird stuff like a garden, because that's pretty normal. And I also expand here on healing the ship, repairing the ship. It takes 15,000 berries worth of supplies to heal 2d4 plus an athletics modifier of damage. You will probably have to repair the ship a few times as your players expand their crew and bring people on, but again, allow them to customize. That's the short of it. Now here's the crew. Those who are familiar with D&D will already know that there are crew mechanics, there are morale mechanics. However, this is not an expansive crew. This is not 20 to 30 people sailing a ship, a galleon. This is a small ship of a close-knit group, or at least it probably will be. That means your players and a few named, detailed NPCs, perhaps better described as DMPCs. See here, as of writing this, the pirates have 10 members, and your players will likely be looking for a similar experience. And so there are crew roles with different roleplay and also mechanical roles attached. So you have the captain. You need a captain. The captain is the de facto leader of the group. Although, of course, all your players will have a say because It's not fun if one person's just ordering everybody. The captain is the key leader. It would be the ones that everyone looks to the guidance, and in order to be the captain, you have to have a minimum charisma of 13. Also, one of the reasons why captains tend to be devil fruit users. On a related note, the captain doesn't have any real attached mechanics because it's presumed that the role play aspect is enough. The fact that they are the captain is enough. And then you have the navigator. The navigator is also very important because when we get into the random events table, you're going to see navigation events, and it is the navigator's job to roll for navigation events. They have to have a minimum intelligence or wisdom, int or wisdom either, of 14, which is substantial. And the navigator is necessary to the functions of the crew. So you need a navigator. Those are the only 2 roles that you need. The rest of them are optional. Doctors require an intelligence or a wisdom of 16, and every 5 days of travel, they passively create a small first aid kit. Additionally, whenever you short rest, having a doctor present at the short rest can grant one player, or character generally, a +1 hit dice to roll. So doctors are useful, but again, intelligence or wisdom of 16, that is a substantial number. Generally speaking, the only people with intelligences or wisdoms of 16, other than high-level characters, are wizards, artificers, druids, etc. Shipwrights. Shipwrights are also pretty important, which is also why their requirements are less. Essentially, when a non-shipwright is repairing the ship, you can only do 50% of damage. So if your ship takes 10 damage in combat, the maximum you can heal is 5, unless the character is a shipwright. Shipwright can do the full 10, assuming they roll high enough. They require proficiency in carpenter's tools and a minimum athletics modifier of +4. And we covered ship repair a bit earlier. Cook. Cooks passively increase the quality of all meals eaten during travel. So basically, if you have a cook, you're not getting scurvy. If you have a cook, you're not getting scurvy, and you can save a lot of money, because you only need to buy poor meals, theoretically. It also means that if you buy a wealthy meal, and you short rest with a cook present, and you eat, that wealthy meal becomes an aristocratic meal. And so having a cook is very useful, and it requires proficiency in cook's utensils and a minimum wisdom of 14. Musicians basically give people inspiration, and it's 1 inspiration per travel. So whenever you travel from one place to the next, a musician can choose 1 person to inspire. This only applies for ship travel. Theoretically. So captain, if you inspire the captain, all ship weapon damage is increased. If you inspire the navigator, then the navigator has a bonus when rolling for navigation checks. Doctors, whenever you roll to inspire the doctor, he can produce small first aid kits faster, which is important because it means that if you can create more first aid kits, you can get 2 before you arrive at the next island, which is pretty major. Shipwrights, it allows you to add in a D4 whenever you roll to repair the ship, which is pretty huge because it comes with no additional supply cost. For cook, it allows you to create a +1 on meals without being consumed. So if you remember before, I said before that when a cook prepares a meal, it only applies to meals eaten. So if you have 10 poor meals in stock and you eat all of them, they will count as modest meals because you have a cook present. If the cook is inspired, then the cook can take one of those modest meals and one of those poor meals and make it into a modest meal. And then, when the meal is actually eaten, it will be considered comfortable because it was upgraded. So if you inspire the cook, you can upgrade meals that you have in storage, but that you have not yet eaten. And you can also inspire fishermen, which allows you to give you a bonus. And then there are flavor roles that really come with no responsibilities. And if you like, you can give these rules mechanic bonuses, but I'm not sure that's strictly necessary. If I'm being perfectly blunt, I feel these roles are enough in terms of mechanics. Maybe a passive bonus here or there, but I wouldn't worry too much about it. And I do want to reiterate, because I was talking before about having a small, close-knit crew. That means your players are going to be inviting NPCs to join them throughout the campaign. A note on that is, it means that when you create NPCs, you have to create NPCs with the assumption that your players might ask them to join the crew. And that's important. You have to assume that they might. They might. Not that they will, that they might. So this means characters, that maybe you don't care too much about, include enough of a foundation that you can extrapolate. And never assume that any one character will or will not join the crew. And the other thing is, don't feel stressed to make them combatants. You can have non-combatant crew members, it's not a big deal. Related to what I've been saying, and this actually comes from D&D podcast Daniel Rustage, it is a lot of pressure for you as the DM to manage several active characters. You're already managing the entire world, and on top of that, you're also responsible for role-playing, 3, 4, 5 characters that your players have taken to. A good way to help with that is by mentoring. Players can take responsibility for characters that you've created, for characters that have joined the crew. Not in that they will roleplay the characters, but in they will be responsible for managing the character's inventory. They'll be responsible for managing the character in combat. Of course, it's your character, so you can veto, but I think it's a good way to offload responsibility, and also a good way to keep you accountable. Because by placing the responsibility on the players, if you forget that a character is present, it's not your fault. It's the player's fault for not reminding you that the character was present. You don't need to keep track of the character's inventory because the player will be keeping track of the character's inventory. And I think that's a great way to offload responsibility as the number of characters that you are responsible for increases. Bounties and wanted posters. If your characters are pirates, they're going to have bounties and they're going to have wanted posters. And they will receive these bounties and wanted posters through the mail, through the news queue that I talked about earlier. I create some general rules, but the basic rule is that whenever your characters, your players, defeat a villain, their bounty will be increased to being slightly higher than the villain that they defeated. And starting off, only the captain will have a bounty, but as your players become more relevant, your player characters, at the very minimum, will also receive bounties. Epithets, they should also receive epithets. Be cautious about it, because of course you don't want to stick your players with epithets that they hate, or epithets that are openly disrespectful to them. But you also want to have fun, so just be cautious, and trust yourself and your players. And, if your players really hate the epithet they got, change it. Session 0. What is it that your characters need? What is it that your players need to do at Session 0? Here are the big things, in addition to what you already need to know: character, class, backstory. What is their character's ultimate goal? What is their dream? Why is it that they are a pirate? Why is it that they're sailing the sea? This is perhaps the most key option. You want to know why they're out. What is it that they're trying to accomplish? How and why did they join this crew in particular? Because theoretically, when you start the game, your players are an established crew. An established crew that hasn't done anything notable, but an established crew nonetheless. And finally, what is their role if they have one? But those are what you need to know prior to Session 1. In addition to what you already need to know. The simplest ways to start a campaign would be either to shipwreck your crew or just resume the adventure. Perhaps you're starting off right off the brink of starting the crew, but just jump in like nothing ever happened, like nothing changed, like you're not just starting a new story. Now, now we get into the interesting part, the races. I'm going to say at the start of it, making races for One Piece races are hard, because One Piece, as mentioned before, doesn't have magic. So it can be difficult, meaning that these races are going to be interesting, especially since, again, there are no languages. So, for instance, for humans, languages are a pretty big deal in terms of their benefits as a race, but there are no languages. And so what I gave instead of an additional language, they get an additional tool proficiency. It's up to you to decide whether that's broken or not. But humans are humans. I don't think we need to linger on that too much. Sky people. Sky people are the people who live in the sky, on the Sky Islands. They resemble humans almost perfectly, except that they have small wings on their back. These wings are non-functional. They don't work. Yeah. So for racial benefits, they have a +2 to charisma, a +1 to wisdom, and then they have the traits Mantra and Cloudwalker. Mantra, 3 times per long rest, the character may give themselves advantage on either a perception check or a dex saving throw after rolling the first dice, and you get 1 mantra back on short rest. Cloudwalker is your proficient in acrobatics and vehicle checks. So, this goes back to what I was saying earlier, right? There's no magic in One Piece, so making unique abilities gets difficult, and it gets difficult very quickly. Because of that, I throw off a lot of proficiencies. However, proficiencies can be a big deal, especially when you're talking about rogues. So whenever I say proficiency, consider switching proficiency for +2. So maybe instead of proficiency in acrobatics, because proficiency scales with level, maybe just add a +2, and then they can be proficient in addition to that if they wish to be. So maybe consider replacing it with a static +2, but I'll leave it to you. Half giants. Half giants are half human, half giants. One notable thing is that they are large. Do you see that? So Z Bradshaw, which some of you from the D&D side of things may recognize, has a great video on the complications of large player characters. If you find that large player characters are too difficult, maybe consider making them medium, like Goliaths. Because, for instance, half giants, I do reference Goliaths. They have a +2 to strength, +2 to con, -1 to dex, but other than that, they have Stone's Endurance, which is a Goliath ability, Powerful Build, which is a Goliath ability. They're bigger and they're slower than Goliaths. And that's the only difference. Three-Eye Tribe is largely a mystery. We don't know too much about it. But I still think it's important. Three-Eye Tribes, we don't know much about them, except they have 3 eyes, and they have a secret ability, which I call here Key to the World Secrets, which allows them to read languages that they can't. So if you are a Three-Eye Tribe player, and you encounter language you can't understand, you can make a wisdom check. And if you exceed the DC of 17, you can understand it. And if you roll a critical success or a roll over 25 either, you can read it exactly. Which is really the special ability of the Three-Eye Tribe, which makes having a three-eyed character around very important if your characters are looking to read the poneglyphs. They have Mind's Eye, which allows them proficiency on Insight check, and My Eyes are up here, which allows them to take proficiency in either Persuasion or Intimidation. Again, consider trading proficiency for just a flat +2. I leave it to your discretion. Tentatas are unique. If you look, Tentatas are tiny. They are legitimately a hand tall. They're about the size of an apple. Perhaps it'd be better to say they're the size of a squirrel. As a DM, I would not allow your players to play as Tentatas. I included Tentatas for the sake of completion. I would not recommend playing as them, because they are very unique, and they have a lot of complications that will require you, as the Dungeon Master, to make a lot of calls. because just having a tiny player character is already a pretty big deal. So anyway, they have a +2 to dexterity, makes sense. They also have a 40-foot movement speed, which ought not to be scoffed at. A +2 to con, but a -3 to both intelligent and wisdom. Because one of the things about the Tatas is they're very small. They're also very, very stupid. They are very stupid. Their abilities, they have the minuscule ability. So the hit dice are D4 for casting classes, D6 for fighter. I would say D8 for probably D8 for barbarian, because I believe barbarians use a D12. Incoming range attacks have their effective range halved in terms of when disadvantage is applied, and they can use daggers as a two-handed weapon, which is one of the big things about the Tentanas that make them difficult. They need unique weapons. They can't wield a sword. They're too short. Well, actually, they might be able to, because one of the things about Tentanas is that their strength doesn't change. So they might actually be able to use a sword. I take that back, but they can use daggers as a two-handed weapon, because they're so small. Unseen Fairy, you have advantage on stealth. And you have naivety. You have disadvantage when resisting charm and when trying to resist insight, so on deception. Disadvantage on charm and when resisting charm, or when you're trying to deceive. And if you fail an insight check, you will automatically assume the best possible interpretation. Here's what I say about Tentatas. They're fun for a one-shot. I would not recommend them for a long-term campaign. They're fun for a one-shot, would not recommend a long-term campaign. The long arm tribe. Long arms, they're very similar to bugbears. They have long arms. Specifically, their arms are double jointed, which makes them interesting. They're also pretty famous for being untrustworthy and shysters. And so they have a +2. One other thing, they're short, which also means that they're slow, and they have a speed of 25 feet. But they have a +2 to intelligence, a +1 to dex. They have long-limbed, which allows them to extend their melee range by 5 feet. Shyster, proficiency, sleight of hand. Remember what I said about proficiencies earlier. Middle management may take an additional proficiency in one of the following: stealth, performance, persuasion, or deception. Long leg tribes have long legs. Their long legs are not double jointed. They're not, but they are long, and they're pretty famous as the quote pinnacle of humanoid beauty. They have a speed of 40 feet. They have a +2 to charisma, +1 to dex. They have an additional 5 feet of melee range, but only when they're kicking, and they get a proficiency in either persuasion or intimidation. Snake neck tribes, they have long necks. That's really all you need to know. They have long necks. +2 intelligence, +1 to charisma. My eyes are up here. 1 proficiency in either persuasion or intimidation, and then periscope, which is proficiency in persuasion and investigation. Again, consider +2 instead. Fishmen. Fishmen are special. Fishmen are half fish, half man, and that gives them a lot of unique abilities. So the base Fishman has, notably, a swim speed of 30 feet, so that means his speed is not halved underwater. He's a +2 to strength, a +1 to con. He is amphibious, which means he can breathe in air and in water. He's a natural athlete, which means he has proficiency in athletics. And then he has animal enhancement. So whatever animal he is, he can take a trait from. I'd recommend using natural armor as a default, which is just a +1 to AC. But for instance, if you are a pufferfish fisherman, maybe your special ability is that your unarmed attacks deal poison damage. Who knows? It depends on what the fisherman is based off of. There's room for customization. Then finally, they have powerful build, which increases their carry weight. But there's also subspecies. So there's the shark fishermen. Shark fishermen are more aggressive, and they're more powerful, but they're also slower. They have a swim speed of 40 feet, so they can swim faster than the base fishermen, but their walking speed is only 20 feet. They have a +2 to strength, +1 to con, and they're very similar to the base fishermen, except that they have the ability Blood Frenzy. After damaging an enemy with a melee attack, add +1 to your next melee attack and damage rolls. This effect stacks and lasts until you either miss, take damage, or the end of combat. In other words, shark fisherman fighters are insane. Then they have menacing, which gives them proficiency in intimidation. Octopus and squid fishermen. They are unique, not in the least of which, because they have many arms. 3 arms for octopus, 4 arms for squid. They have +1 to strength, +2 to dex, +1 to con, but then they have a -3 to intelligence and wisdom, because they're very stupid. But unlike Tentata, which is -3 to both intelligence and wisdom, for the octopus/squid fisherman, you can distribute the -3 as you seem fit. So you can take all 3 from intelligence, all 3 from wisdom, or 1 from one and 2 from the other. In addition to being amphibious and a natural athlete, they are many-limbed. It doesn't have many practical advantages, except that they have advantage on grapple attempts and climb-based athletics. They have limb regrowth, so if they lose one of their arms, it will grow back in 10 days, which is important because of their dummy arm ability. If they fail a dex save by either 1 or 2, depending on which variant they are, they can choose to succeed by sacrificing one of their arms. However, they do take damage. But this only applies if they fail by either 1 for the squid or 2 or 1 for octopus, so only a near miss. And then they have Blackjet. It is a ranged attack of 20 feet, which allows them to blind an enemy, but they can only be used once every 3 rounds of combat. A few notable things: they have resistance to poison damage. Maybe cut that? You can feel free to consider cutting that. That may be a little too far. Oh, and I didn't mention 20 feet for walking speed, 40 feet for swim speed. And on top of that, if they wear heavy armor, medium or heavy armor, sorry, it will disable dummy arm. So that dummy arm ability, which allows them to be pretty impressive, if they wear medium or heavy armor, that ability is disabled. Ray Fishmen get a +1 to strength or con. They have a walking speed of 30 feet, swim speed of 60 feet, so they're very fast. +1 to strength or con, +2 to dex. They have the hydrodynamic ability, which is when they're underwater, they receive advantage on melee attack rolls and on dex and strength saving throws, and also receive a +1 to all attack and damage rolls. And then they also have the elbow blades ability, which is whenever they make unarmed strikes, they may use the fin on their elbows instead and deal slashing damage. Ray Fishman is almost a monk archetype. It's based on speed, being very fast, and also being very consistent in very specific situations. And then you have the half fishman. So half fishman, or half human, half fishman. They have walking speed of 30 feet, swim speed of 30 feet, +2 to con, +1 to charisma, and then a +1 to either strength or dex. But notably, you'll notice they do not have amphibious. They cannot breathe underwater. They can swim fast, but they cannot breathe underwater. And then they have animal enhancement, like the base fishman does. Merfolk, upper half of a human, lower half of a fish. This makes them very interesting as player characters, but I tried my best. See, they have a walking speed of 15 feet because they don't have legs, but they have a swim speed of 70 feet. They are the fastest aquatic creature. The fastest. They have a +3 to charisma. No other ability score increases. They are amphibious. They can breathe in air and water. They have animal enhancement. And then they also have hydrodynamic, if you remember that from the Ray Fishman. They also have piscic communication, so they can talk with fish, meaning that they can use persuasion or intimidation instead of animal handling when interacting with them. And of course, they can talk to fish, which is an advantage in of itself. They also have the unique tail slam attack. Whenever they perform a melee attack, they can attack with their tails instead, and if they hit, they do a contested athletics check, pushing their enemy back on a failure. However, when a merfolk turns 30, their tail splits, and they get 2 legs, where once was a single tail. So this changes things a bit. Their walking speed is 25 feet, but their swim speed is only 50 feet, because they got old. They have a +2 to charisma, a +2 to wisdom, because they got old, but a -1 to dexterity. The assumption with their merfolk is because they're on their tail, they can actually jump and flip-flop back and forth, which is useful for acrobatics. They're actually naturally good at acrobatics because they have to be acrobatic in order to walk. But that's not true. So, of the over 30. And so they get a -1 to dex, because they're coming to rely on their legs, but their legs are not as good as my legs or your legs, and they're also not as convenient as sometimes the ability to flop around can be. But other than that, they have the same abilities, except that their tail slam only applies when they're underwater. Oh, the other thing I missed for both of them is that they have disadvantage on climbing athletics checks, and they can't wear medium or heavy armor. Or if they did wear medium and heavy armor, it'd be... I might change that. Maybe just heavy armor? Maybe just heavy armor, but that's how I'm going to roll it for the moment. Minks. Minks are furries. They are anthropomorphic animals. There is an individual mink type for every furred land mammal. And they also have some unique abilities that you might not assume to be there. +1 to strength, +1 to dex, +1 to an ability score of their choice. And a reminder, minks can take the shape of any anthropomorphic animal. So they have natural athlete, they have animal enhancement, default to claw attack. So that's to be expected. But then they also have electro. Electro is an ability unique to minks where they are able to generate electricity. How they do this exactly, not really sure. But whenever they melee attack with unarmed strike or a metal weapon, minks can add 1d4 of lightning damage, and they can do this as many times as their player level. It resets on long rest, and half is restored on a short rest. So if you expend 3 uses, you get, I'd say, 1 use back. And then they have Sulong. At nights, minks can transform by looking at their moon. And they get a lot of bonuses. I'm not going to go into it completely. You can read over it in your own time, but basically, they become a boss monster, but at the cost of potentially attacking their allies. And they can only do this once a week, I believe. Might be once every 10 days. Once a week, there we are. But as I explained with the fishmen, there are variants. But this time, it's only by size. So you have the large minks, so these would be your minotaurs. They have, in essence, the same abilities, except they have a +2 to strength, a +1 to con. They have less of a... They're slower, they have a 20-foot move speed. And they have a unique Sulong that matches their large stature. Maybe you could consider dumping the speed decrease, but this is how I've ruled it for the moment. Again, I would reference Z. Bradshaw, his video. He has a great video explaining the complexities of having a large player character. Can't recommend it enough. Finally, you have the small minks. Small minks are small creatures, obviously. They are essentially your gnomes. They're incredibly short, they're skittish, they're flexible. These are your mouse minks, your monkey minks, your... I was about to say rabbit minks, but actually, historically, that's not the case. Regardless, these are the really small minks. They receive a +2 to dexterity, a +1 to charisma, and then they have the abilities first, like a mouse, like a fox, which allows them to take proficiency in either stealth or sleight of hand, and then they also have, again, a unique Sulong. They are unique because they have their animal enhancement, like a mouse, like a fox, and then they can have agility. The way that's feline agility, it's a tabaxi ability. The way I've rolled it is that they can have 2 of those 3. So they can have animal enhancement, feline agility, but they can't have like a mouse or like a fox. They can have like a mouse, like a fox, and feline agility, but they can't have animal enhancement. That's how I've ruled it. Finally, you have the modified human. In other words, a cyborg. These are... well, they're cyborgs, they're robots, they're modified humans. They receive a +2 to their con score, a +1 to another ability score. They have Sentry's Rest, which means they don't have to sleep. Their AC is increased by 1, and then they have a special ability. Well, they have Specialized Design, which is a a robot ability, a Warforged ability, sorry. You gain 1 skill proficiency and 1 tool proficiency of choice, and then you also have body modification. Whenever the modified human increases a physical score when they level up, they can do so a second time if they subtract from a different physical score. So this essentially allows you to min-max up the wazoo. Because you are modified. And so one of the abilities of the modified human is to modify themselves further. Now isn't this fun? Translating magic classes. This is a long explanation, but I provide the TLDR here. If your players can justify their talents in universe, let it happen. This is how I defend it. If you look at Nami, she is a wizard. Her abilities are in line with the Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition wizard. I'd actually say the same of Usopp. I would suggest that Usopp is a wizard. There's an argument for druid, but I'd say wizard. I'd say wizard. Now, naturally, the more magical your players are, the more you, as the dungeon master, will have to interfere. Because there are a lot of things that work, and I believe that you can create a full warlock, a full wizard, a full artificer, without actually running into problems, as long as you do it correctly. But it does mean that you have to do it correctly. You have to oversee them. You have to be sure that for every spell they learn, they have to explain how they're doing it. Because there's no magic. However, they do have inherited will. I talk about this a bit. Warlocks, for instance. Eldritch Blast? What is Eldritch Blast if not an anime air slice? Hexblade's Curse is just the intimidating aura of the blade's thirst for blood. What is Misty Step if not the anime teleports behind you? There are a lot of near magic abilities in One Piece that you can use as a reference. And make full use of it. Make full use of it. But be cautious. For instance, I talk about it here. I don't think there's any way to communicate cleric or druid. Wizard works fine, bard works fine, warlock works fine, artificer works fine. Clerics and druids don't work. There's an argument for cleric. But druid, I'm sorry, wild shape doesn't work. Wild shape cannot translate. It doesn't work. Druids can't happen. Clerics, I don't think clerics can happen. Now, I will say, perhaps in light of this, maybe consider allowing your players to use wisdom as a spellcasting modifier, even if they're a wizard, even if they're a sorcerer, even if they're a warlock. Maybe consider allowing them to use wisdom as their modifier, because the two main wisdom spellcasters are not available to them. But as for how you can go about explaining magical abilities, some of them can be translated to willpower, but the easiest example, I think, is the Technomancer, because that's what Usopp and Nami do. Usopp and Nami just explain their powers away using technology, and you can do the same. And so that's how I would shorthand magic translation, is technology. Magnets. How do magnets even work? So that's the shorthand explanation. I'd recommend reading through this chapter yourself, but as a shorthand explanation, if they can justify it, let it happen. Alright, and here we are at the true kit and caboodle of it all. The Haki and the Devil Fruits, and how they work mechanically. First, we have to go over what Devil Fruits are. As said before, they are awful tasting fruits, and when you eat them, you get special powers. But if you remember, I mentioned before, Devil Fruit users can't swim. They can't. And so here's how that works mechanically. If the water level is below the power holder's knees, it doesn't do anything. There's no effect. If the water level is at or above the knee, they receive exhaustion for as long as that condition allows, meaning that if they exit the water, they're fine. At or above waist, it's exhaustion level 3. And they have to make a charisma check in order to use devil fruit spells or cantrips, or any devil fruit abilities for that matter. And they'll have disadvantage to hit. So basically, if it's at or above the waist, they're nearly useless where their devil fruit is concerned. If they're submerged, or if the water level is above the ribs, they are paralyzed. Well, they're paralyzed. That's important. However, it's not just water. There's sea stone, which contains the essence of the ocean. And if your players or your characters who have devil fruit abilities come in contact with sea stone, it's the same as the rib water level, so that's exhaustion level 3. Devil fruit reincarnation, simplified, whenever a power holder dies, their fruit is reincarnated. It appears somewhere else in the world. We don't know exactly how it works. That's the best summary I can give you. Devil fruits as magic items. So this is where we go into actual translations. So when you eat a devil fruit, what happens in terms of mechanics? Broadly speaking, there are two approaches. One of the approaches you're already familiar with. Well, actually, you might be familiar with both if you've watched Rustage's D&D podcast. But generally, there are two ways you can treat devil fruits. Either as magic items, which attune when you eat them, and give you the special fruit ability plus not being able to swim. Or, second, as a subclass, which you level into and grow into. Both have their merits and demerits. For instance, you don't want magic items to become useless over time, especially because they're permanent. However, if you implement a scaling feature, that also means that players who eat devil fruits later will be at a necessary disadvantage. Or, if they are at the same level, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense for them to be just as able with their devil fruit as someone who has had their devil fruit for ages. It doesn't make sense. So my solution is this. For devil fruits which have a which lack a combat function, which absolutely cannot be treated as a subclass. For instance, the devil fruit, which I think is the best example of this, would be Kinnamon's garb fruit. You can't be a sorcerer with the ability to create clothes. I'm afraid that doesn't work. So that would be a magic item. It would be a pure magic item, which would just allow you to create clothing. And like an illusion, if you're trying to deceive someone, you would basically make a spell check, and then that would be your deception. I'm not even sure, for something like the garb fruit, for a fruit that is so specific and limited in its use, I'm not even sure I would add a limit. Just let them do it. It's the same as a disguise kit, basically. So I'm not even sure I would assign a limit. So what I would do is I would take to your players, whenever you have a devil fruit, that devil fruit is a magic item. It is a magic item. And when they eat it, it attunes to them, and they get a certain list of passive abilities. However, for fruits which are not the garb fruit, for fruits which actually have combat potential and potential for growth, you can multiclass into a sorcerer to actually effectively train the fruit, to effectively grow into it and expand the abilities in ways which are abstract but also very powerful. That's how I would do it. So there's the passive abilities, but then you can also expand into them. But for fruits which can't be expanded, it just doesn't happen. However, when we get into Haki, I was talking earlier of the issues with devil fruits as magic items. One of the ways around that is to use Haki. We'll go into it later, but basically we have Haki dice, and if you find that one player is falling behind the rest because they lack a devil fruit, it might be a good idea to grant them a few extra Haki dice. And then the scaling problem essentially becomes mute. But then you also have the problem of other players receiving a bit of favoritism, which might create drama at the table, but the point is, it's a case-by-case basis, but that's my 2 cents. But why sorcerers? Well, the simple answer is because devil fruits alter the lineage factor, which, if you remember, is the DNA, which is what sorcerers are. Sorcerers are people with altered DNA, which allows them to cast spells and use magic. That's what they are. So having them as sorcerers makes sense, as well as sorcerers. I didn't mention this before, but sorcerers don't make sense in a 5e in a One Piece context. There's nobody running around with the blood of dragons that would allow them to cast spells. That just doesn't happen. Or if it does happen, it only happens in very, very specific connotations. I also feel like meta magic works very well because the magic is a part of your body. The magic, quote unquote, the devil fruit abilities move in response to your will. And so meta magic is a manifestation of your will. And it makes sense that you would have that sort of deep personal connection with your abilities. And so power holders are sorcerers. There are 3 devil fruit types. There's the Paramecia, which is, well, let me say this first. Devil fruits are grouped by their abilities. Paramecias are anything, they're a mixed bag. Zones are devil fruits which allow you to turn into animals. Logias are devil fruits which give you the power to channel elements. That's the basics. So Logias are elements, zones are animals, Paramecia is everything else under the sun. I'm not going to go into a full list now, but for those of you who are unfamiliar, you can find lists online. All the devil fruits in One Piece, all the Paramecia devil fruits. Just take a look. It gets pretty crazy. Anyway, let's get into it. The Paramecia subclass. So, there are 2 types of Paramecias. There's the transformed types, so this would include Luffy's Gum Gum fruit, the Chop Chop fruit, or even the Mochi Mochi fruit, which permanently alter the properties of the user's body. So when you're dealing with transformed types, transformed Paramecias as characters can fill a variety of roles, but generally they're likely going to end up as mixed combatants, because the fact that their body is altered means that they can, usually, under most circumstances, take damage better, and also deal it out in very specific ways. So they'll tend to be sort of semi-martial combatants, which sorcerers tend to be anyway. So it's not too much of an issue. But related to this, if your players are truly looking for a Luffy-type experience, maybe consider granting some fighter abilities as spells. For instance, maybe they can cast Second Wind as a spell, as a 2nd level spell. Who knows? But consider it. But it's not too much of a big deal because of course they can always multi-class anyway. But the reason I reference that is because transformed types more than the other types are going to have trouble getting spells, making spells. So it's an option. So at first level, and this would include the passive abilities. So these would be the abilities you get just by eating the fruit. Because it transforms your body, what you get when you eat the fruit is essentially damage resistance. So for instance, the Gum Gum fruit would be resistant to bludgeoning damage. Chop Chop would be immunity to slashing. That's Buggy's devil fruit. Though I would say that immunity ought to come with some kind of drawback, because immunity is a big deal. I shouldn't have to tell you. And then at level 6, they'll gain a +1 to their max HP, and an additional +1 upon level up. So people who notice will say, people who are big D&D nerds will see that I took a bit from the Draconic Sorcerer, which isn't a big deal because you can't play a Draconic Sorcerer anyway, barring specific circumstances. The reason I did it like this is because the resistance and immunity is a big deal, and so it makes sense that the bonus to HP isn't coming until later. That's my defense, but it also does make sense that it would get a bonus to HP, because, remember, it is their body that is being altered. It is their body that is being altered. Luffy's body is altered into rubber. Katakuri's body is altered into mochi. It makes sense that because the properties of their body is changing, they would become more constitute, let's say. But that's alright, because they don't have to worry about it until level 14. which is when they unlock their Devil Fruit Awakening, and this does not have any, there's no rules attached to this specifically, because the awakening of the Devil Fruit is something that is unique to each Devil Fruit as far as we can tell. There are some general rules, which is that a transformed Paramecia, whether it be Luffy or Katakuri, they generally have the power to transform things into their element, and that's true of most Paramecias. So Luffy could transform things into rubber, Katakuri can transform things into mochi. That's the basic idea. However, awakenings are different, and there are awakenings that don't follow that. So the short of it is that awakenings ought to offer a unique dimension to the player's abilities. And you don't have to worry about it till level 14. So you'll have plenty of time to decide what that awakening is. At level 18, they gain an ability called Personal Hell. By expending 5 sorcery points, all objects in a 60-foot radius, including buildings and the earth itself, the environment, gain the properties of the user's awakening. So if you have the ability to transform things into mochi as your awakening, then all of the terrain becomes mochi. The terrain will become difficult for all except the caster and the allies of his choice, and the caster can manipulate the environment with limited ability. So he can manipulate the environment to become even more difficult for enemies. But that's essentially the ability, is creating a difficult terrain for enemies. The second Paramecia type is the emitter type. Emitter types are Devil Fruits which allow you to affect your environment rather than strictly changing yourself. So easy examples are Law's Ape Ape Fruit, Foxy's Slow Fruit, Boa Hancock's Mera Love Fruit. It's any Devil Fruit which allows you to affect your environment. However, these are a bit harder than the transform types to make rules for. That's because emitters have a wide range of abilities with a wide range of capabilities, even more so than the transformed Paramecia. The transformed Paramecia is pretty simple. Their body transforms, but not to the extent that a Logia does. Emitter types are different, because emitter types can have any ability under the sun. And so because of that, their abilities are more general and less specific. So at level 1, players just receive a +1 to their charisma score, and that's it. At level 6, they do gain an ability called Unassuming Stature, which is whenever they cast a spell or a cantrip which requires the target to make a saving throw, if the target is unaware of the caster's status as a Devil Fruit user, they will have disadvantage. So basically, it gives you a one-time advantage on the first spell you cast in an encounter. That's what it allows you to do. At level 14, the fruit will awaken. Again, some will have the same awakening as transformed, but not always. For instance, I referenced the slow fruit. It doesn't make sense to turn things into slow photons or slow particles. So, either way, it still adds a new dimension to the power, but what that new dimension is not clear at all. So, but it's not until level 14, so you have plenty of time to deliberate. Level 18, you can use Personal Hell if you have a typical awakening. So if you have the awakenings I was just describing, where you transform things into your element, then you can use Personal Hell. Second is the Devil Inside. So the Devil Inside is a reference to a common thread of abilities, which is actually relatively common in One Piece, but not often talked about. So Magellan has this ability, Hawkins has this ability, even Brook has this ability. And what you see is this giant shadow of a demon form behind them. And this demon, which is made of whatever material they can manipulate. So for Hawkins, it's straw. For Magellan, it's poison. For Brook, it's his soul. This demon, quote unquote, can actually interact with the environment and cause damage, and it actually seems to be semi-sentient. So it's an insane ability, but we've never received an explanation for it. But that's what the Devil Inside is. It's a demon formed from your element, the element or the energy that you can create. That's what the Devil Inside is. and so it's formed from the substance you emit or a coalescence of affected objects. Hostile creatures must make a wisdom saving throw, becoming feared, and then the demon can attack. Instead, the caster with the demon can choose to attack with the demon instead of casting a spell. And that's it. Now, zones. Zones are funny. Zones are complicated. They're simple in concept because zones are really simple. You turn into an animal, or you can turn into a hybrid, which is half human and half of the animal you can turn into. And there are a lot of spells like that in Dungeons & Dragons. There's polymorph, there's wild shape, but what polymorph and wild shape are dependent on is challenge ratings. The only reason polymorph and wild shape are powerful is because you can transform into animals of higher and higher challenge ratings, different animals. However, for zone, you are stuck with the same animal. You're stuck with the same animal throughout. What that also means is that a chicken devil fruit user needs to be as approximately powerful or approximately useful as a T-Rex zone, which, as you can imagine, is very difficult. So it's a little crazy, but we're going to talk about it. First, though, I do want to go over alternatives. Because zones are so complicated, I can't help but offer an alternative. So, the easy example is just other races. Play an Aerochra if you want a bird fruit. Play a Tabaxi if you want a cat fruit. Play a Kenku if you want a crow fruit. It's the simplest answer. It's simple. And the reason I offer these examples is precisely because they're simple. The Shifter race is a pre-existing race, and it's simple. The Beast Barbarian, or even regular barbarians, it doesn't have to be a Beast Barbarian. Beast Barbarians are more authentic, of course, to the zone idea, but, I mean, I can reference One Piece Dungeons & Dragons. It's not any stretch of the imagination to just say, okay, you're a barbarian, whenever you rage, you turn into an animal. You don't get any bonuses, it's just a flavor. Runic Fighter, if you don't know, allows you to turn into a giant. Maybe you turn into a dinosaur instead. And then there's just flavor, which is your character has the devil fruit, but it doesn't do anything except take away his ability to swim, which is a bit depressing, but it is an option. But I did make the subclasses, so we'll go into that. First, we have the base zones, which are, quote, normal animals. So when you eat the zone fruit, you gain two abilities. You gain the ability to turn into the animal, and you gain the ability to turn into a hybrid of the animal. Generally speaking, the hybrid has higher capabilities and better stat bonuses, but you are the animal, meaning you can't wield a weapon. You can talk, I believe. Yes, you can talk, but there are natural limits that come with being an animal. However, this is something that's a bit important. It doesn't function like normal polymorph, and we'll get into that. So, whenever they transform, they retain all of their ability scores. They actually retain their ability scores. The reason for that is because, again, if you remember, I have to find a way to make a chicken as strong as a Tyrannosaurus. The way to do that is to keep ability scores the same. So you are as strong in your human form as you are in your animal form, but you get bonuses to make up for that. So let's get into those bonuses. So the bonuses you get are determined on your type. There are 5 types: strength type, speed type, flight type, armor type, and insectoid type. So strength type is for animals that are big and strong, ox, elephants, etc. Speed types are for ones that are really fast, cheetahs, gazelles, etc. Flight types, birds, bats. Armor types would be turtles, for the most part. Insectoid types are either insects or tiny creatures, so mice, rats, squirrels. So at first level, you have the ability to transform into your animal. You retain all ability scores and gain 1 hit dice of temporary HP per spell level. So this is important. It is a spell. Transforming is a spell. We'll get into why that's important. In this form, you may use Action Surge as a 2nd level spell once per combat and cannot use weapons or items. The transformation lasts for up to 1 hour and is cast as a bonus action if the animal that is subject to the transformation is tiny, small, use insectoid rules regardless of the overall type. They have access to homebrew spells and cantrips, so that is the key. So whenever you transform, you have access to homebrewed spells and abilities, which may or may not overlap with the natural abilities of the creature. These spells and abilities are only able to be accessed when you're transformed. So what this does is it gatekeeps your spells. It gatekeeps your spells, so you can only use spells when you transform. Otherwise, you can't cast them at all. And that is sort of the key of the Zoan Sorcerer. The Zoan Sorcerer can only use spells by casting a spell. And that gatekeeping, of course, will fall off over time, but that it is there. It is there. And I'll also address this at the top. When you use these spells, because they are naturally physical and having to do with your animal abilities, do you use your physical ability scores or do you use charisma? I say use charisma. Reason being is that you can always just attack. Attacking is the same as it always was. If you attack with your horns or with your teeth, that's still a strength-based ability and you get bonuses for that, but spells are special abilities with special buffs and debuffs, so they should still use charisma. Anyway. So you have strength type, which gives you a +1 to strength and con per spell level. So, actually let me correct that. +1 to strength and con checks. So it's not a +1 to your ability score, it's a +1 to your checks. So whenever you make a strength check in your animal form, if you're a strength type, you get a +1 to strength. Same's true of speed with dex. Flight is, you can choose strength or dex if you remember. But you only get to 1, you don't get any bonus to con. If you're armor type, you get +1 to con and a +2 to unarmored AC. But I believe, yes, your movement speed is halved. Because you're a turtle. Deal with it. Insectoid type, you get no demerits to dex or movement, even if you're really small. So even if your movement is like 10, you don't get a demerit if you're insectoid type. You get a +1 per spell level to stealth and sleight of hand checks, and a +1 per spell level to strength, con, and dex saving throws, as well as all attack and damage rolls. But only saving throws. So only saving throws and attack and damage rolls. No other checks. And that's just to be sure that you can defend yourself and you're not completely helpless. That's what that is. And then you have the hybrid form. Now, all that I said about the full transformation applies. The same ability scores +1 hit dice to gain temporary HP. The difference is that the bonuses you get aren't as extreme, but you can still use weapons. That's the difference. It also only lasts 5 minutes. So while your animal transformation lasts much longer, hybrid form, you can use weapons, but you can't stay in it as long. So strength type, it's +1 every 2 spell levels to strength and con-based checks. And then the same applies as above. Except for insectoid type. Because here's what you need to know. When you turn into an animal, you turn into the animal. So if you turn into a tiny animal, it doesn't matter if you're a giant. You're tiny. You're tiny. You could homebrew that rule, but generally speaking, it doesn't matter what size you are. You take the size of the animal you transform into. So if it's an elephant, you become large. If it's an ant, you become tiny. That's not true of hybrid. Hybrid, you remain the same size that you are. You do not shrink, you do not grow, except maybe a few feet in either direction, but not enough to actually change your size category. So if you have an ant devil fruit, your hybrid form is the same size as your normal form. So insectoid type, the difference actually is important. You get a +1 to all constitution checks and saving throws, and then +1 to AC for every 2 spell levels. The idea being that if you're an insect, you have armor. This is also where I remind you that if you're a mouse, then you would be a speed type, but you would use insectoid rules when determining your full transformation. That's important. At 6th level, you gain new abilities. So special transformation. What this allows you to do is you get a variant hybrid. So using the mouse example from before, a mouse would be a speed type. However, with a variant hybrid, you would gain access to be able to enter a hybrid as a strength type, so you could be a very strong mouse. Someone can clip Tom and Jerry for that. But variant hybrid, so you gain a second hybrid transformation that you can use. But it's only hybrid, that's important. The second thing is you get free transformation. So what you can do is you can transform into either full hybrid or full transformation, or hybrid transformation at 1st level without consuming a spell slot. So remember what I was talking before about the gatekeeping? The gatekeeping starts to fall away now. So now you can enter 1st level without worrying about it. So if you want to transform into a dog just because you want to be a dog for no other reason, go ahead. 1st level, it doesn't use a spell slot. 14th level, you gain a secondary type in addition to what you already had. So that's a 3rd hybrid transformation. You gain free feature. So you may choose a specific feature of your animal form and add it to your non-transformed state. You may use all abilities, spells, and cantrips for it to use this feature as a requirement. You may change this feature at any time. I would suggest change that to arrest, but to use the mouse example before, you want to hear really well, go ahead, take mouse ears. You now have a passive bonus to perception checks that involve hearing. You want claws, now you have claws, and they're just there, they're permanent. Then you have enhance feature, so you may enhance one of your animal features as a bonus action spell. So to use the claw example before, you can use enhance feature on your claws, and now your claws do more damage. That's a spell. So finally, you get a final special transformation at 18th level, and the other thing you get is effectively monster point. A zone user can become a monstrous hybrid. They gain all benefits of casting hybrid transformation at 6th level and increase their size by 2. They have advantage on Constitution and Strength saving throws and Intimidation checks for their duration. The form lasts 3 turns, but can be extended by succeeding a Con saving throw of DC 16 at the end of your turn. At the end of the duration, that you take 1 level of exhaustion for every 3 turns in monster point. I think that's fairly self-explanatory. You become very powerful, but only for a limited time, and you have to use 5 sorcery points. Now we get into the fun part. Mythical zones. How many times have I said that? Now we get into the fun part. This is fun. That's the summary. This is fun. So if you remember, we have 5 types for base zones. Strength type, speed type, flight type, armor type, and insectoid type. Mythical zones only have 2 types. They have mystic type and monstrous type. Mystic type would be for Kitsune, it would be for Phoenix. It would be for creatures which are known for being inherently magical, while monstrous type would be for big, intimidating creatures, dragons, ogres, giants. I suppose not giants, but you understand the idea. Tarask. So you either choose a mystic type or a monstrous type, and you get a passive +1 to your Constitution and Charisma ability scores. I will specify, the reason you get +1 to your ability scores for zones is A, because I feel like that's authentic to what a zone is and what it does, but also because, as I said before, the spell gatekeeping is a pretty big deal, and so I feel it's natural to try and give some handicaps around that inherent obstacle. At 1st level, if they are mystic type, then they have a full transformation, but if they're monstrous type, they only have their hybrid transformation. So if you are a full mystic type, you gain a +1 to charisma rolls and saving throws. including spell attack rolls, +1 to constitution rolls and saving throws, +1 to spell and cantrip damage. If you're a hybrid, then you gain +1 to charisma, +1 to strength, and then +2 to con checks and saving throws. That's what you get. And of course, you also get the same ability to cast spells as before, which Mystic types is actually a bit easier in this regard, because a lot of times you can take spells directly from the compendium. At 6th level, Mythical Zones gain new abilities. Free spell casting. So you can cast spells. Exempting the spells which require physical components, such as claws, teeth, horns. For instance, if you're a Dragon Zone, to go back to that example, you can cast Firebolt. You just blow a fireball from your mouth. You can do that. You no longer need to transform, and that's one of the things about Mythical Zones, is they can cast these spells without having to transform, because their actual transforming is a much bigger deal. Bonus feature. They may add a feature to their person as a bonus action spell. Yeah. It requires concentration, but to go back to the example before, you want claws, you can have claws. It requires concentration, but now you can take the claws from your transformation and put it on your body for a limited period of time. 14th level, you gain the access to whatever you didn't have before. So there's the hybrid mystic type, which is more powerful than the full mystic type, and then the full monstrous type, which is more powerful than the hybrid. One of the reasons for this is because transforming into a hybrid phoenix is a lot more impressive than just transforming into a phoenix, and so you put it off until later. However, the real reason is because it does not make sense. It does not make sense for your player to be transforming into an ancient dragon at level 1. That does not make sense, and I would not recommend it. And to have your player turn into a massive dragon and then not be able to do anything because they're level 1 is even less impressive. So you can't turn into a dragon until you have the power to back it up, and you can't turn into this sage transformation that accesses the mystic abilities of the phoenix or of the kitsune until you've built yourself up for it. So that's the real reason. And full monstrous, they both actually have limits to their duration because they're a lot more powerful. And that's generally the difference between the base zone and the mythical zones. The mythical zone has a higher ceiling, but it's less consistent. Base zones, that's their greatest strength, is that they're consistent. Mythical zones cannot do the things that zones do consistently, but they can do them generally better. That's my interpretation of it. At 18th level, you get Mythic Presence. So, if you're a Mystic type, then enemies are charmed. If you're a Monstrous type, then it's frightened. That's taken directly from the Draconic Sorcerer. And now we have Ancient Zones. So Ancient Zones have much the same issues as before. Much the same issues as before. Turning into a T-Rex at level 1 is a lot, so what do we do about that? Well, first let's go over the basics. So the base zones have 5 types, Mythic Zones have 2 types, Dinosaur Zones, Ancient Zones have 4 types, Power type, which is the Strength, Vicious type, which is Speed, Wing type, which is Flying, and Sturdy, which is Armored. So, for instance, T-Rex, Velociraptor, Pterodon, and Kylosaurus. So after choosing your creature, and I almost forgot to mention, you gain a +2 to con and a +1 to strength, and an unarmored AC of 13. And that's for all Ancient Zones. So they have their full transformation. However, they, almost like Warlocks, they always cast their transformation at the highest available level. And that's important, because it means that over the period of encounters, the zone's maximum ability will decrease a lot more sharply than others, the same way a Warlock does. A Ancient Zone sorcerer will be weaker, much weaker, by the third battle than his allies would be. Of course, they're all weaker, but the problem is that the Ancient Zoan Sorcerer has less capability to manage his resources. He has less will. And I also think it's a good choice just because these are dinosaurs, and you want them to be frightening. Similar to what I was talking about with the dragon example before. This way, at the very least, whenever your players enter the dinosaur transformation, they will always be as strong as they can possibly be. So when they transform into a power type, +2 to all strength and con rolls, including attack rolls and those, +2 to dex and con, flight, +1 either dex, strength, and con. So wing type actually does get con bonuses, while the flight type doesn't. Straight type gets a +3 to con, movement halved, +2 to AC. 6 zone, you gain bonus feature. Talked about bonus feature already. You take a feature from your animal and you can add it to your base body as a spell. And this is the first step to getting around the spell requirement. Because bonus feature is a lot more important for Ancient Zoan Sorcerers than for Mythic Zoan Sorcerers. Reason being, discussed before, whenever Ancient Zones transform, they always use their highest available spell levels. It's not true of Mythic Zones. So 6th level bonus feature is really the key to working around their natural weakness, to working around their inability to manage their resources. It's not until 14th level that they get their hybrid transformation. And so whenever they cast hybrid transformation, which can only be cast at 3rd level or higher, they gain access to the same capabilities as the full transformation at the level below, while still being able to use weapons or items. So even hybrid transformation is still... Their hybrid transformation is much better than a lot of the other hybrid transformations. Reason being, hybrid transformation is their way of exuding control. So hybrid transformation is what they necessarily have to do in order to get around their natural weakness. So a Ancient Zone casting hybrid transformation at 4th level is the same as if they cast the full transformation at 3rd level in terms of stat bonuses. But they can still use weapons and items. Enhanced feature, you know what enhanced feature it is. And then they have Ancient Presence, which is the true Draconic Presence. They can choose either Charmed or Frightened. 1 minute requires concentration. Now the Logia subclass. You'll be relieved to know that the Logia subclass is much, much simpler. Much simpler. If you remember, the Logia allows you to transform into an element. So at 1st level, you gain the Elemental Form ability. You gain +1 to your max HP, and again, whenever you level up, when attacking with an unarmed strike or taking damage from an unarmed strike, they deal 1d4 of elemental damage to the target or attacker, depending on what element they are. So if they're fire, this would be fire damage. If they're electricity, it'd be lightning damage. If the Logia type does not deal damage to physical contact with like smoke for example, then an unarmored AC of 13 is appropriate. Then they have the 2 abilities, Shifting Form and Shift Form. Shifting Form, by expending a 1st level spell slot, they can disengage as a bonus action. It's a free spell. They can disperse their body and they can disengage as a bonus action. Shift Form is basically the shield spell. +5, it's a reaction, +5 until the start of your next turn. That's what Shift Form is. Now, I will leave it to your discretion as a dungeon master whether these spells ought to be a part of their spell list or whether it ought to be an addendum to their spell list. But the other important thing to note is Haki bypass, which gets important when we'll talk about Haki, which is that characters that use Haki can deny both Shift Form and Shifting Form by using Haki dice. At 6th level, they gain the ability in your element, which is whenever they are fully encompassed, they get a bunch of stuff. The reason I'm being so flippant about a bunch of stuff is because it's very difficult, very rare for your characters to be fully encompassed. So I see example here. Airwind Logia is only fully encompassed when extremely strong winds, such as a tornado or hurricane. The general principle of being fully encompassed is that if you are fully encompassed, then you are so surrounded by the element that if the element deals damage, you would be taking damage. That is the principle. And so that's not going to happen often, unless, of course, if your character is a fog Logia, then I imagine it would happen fairly frequently, but it's not going to happen often. So that's why I'm being a bit flippant about it. Second is elemental weapon. I'm going to summarize elemental weapon as basically spiritual weapon. That's what it allows you to do. We've seen this happen in the series before. It happened with Kizaru, it happened with Aokiji. You could even argue that Ace's Fire Fist is an extension of it, but they deal damage. Specifically 1d8 plus their charisma modifier elemental damage. It is slightly different than spiritual weapon, but it is so similar that we'll just call it spiritual weapon. And finally, they gain elemental absorption. So they gain resistance to their elemental damage type, and they deny elemental damage of the type when it would be 5 or under. So say for example, I am a fire Logia, and I take a firebolt, let's say, and the firebolt deals 12 damage. Okay, it's halved to 6. Now let's say I get hit by another firebolt, and it hits for 8. Well, I have resistance, so that becomes 4. However, because it's under 5, it becomes denied entirely, so I take no damage. That's how absorption works. At 14th level, you gain new abilities. Alter Density. You can fly for free, but at half your movement speed. So you can fly, but you're slow. And then you have Reparticleize, which is essentially a teleport spell, but what it does is you do not need to have sight. So most teleport spells require sight. Reparticleize does not. It allows you to move without inducing opportunity attacks, and you can move to locations which your character could not normally see. At 18th level, and this is a big deal, so if you remember, I talked about in your element, it only applies when you are fully encompassed. Well, 18th level allows you to make that happen. You can use 5 sorcery points to make the environment fully encompassed in an elemental storm. It deals 2d4 elemental damage every turn you remain in the space, or 1d4, half the damage, on a successful con saving throw against the spellcaster's spell DC. It lasts 1 minute or until the caster exits the area. And you can spend additional points to be sure that your allies don't get hurt as well, because the elemental storm is pretty... it doesn't care who you are, but you can make it care by expending additional sorcery points. Logia Sorcerer is the simplest, but that's also why I worry about it a bit. Because the zone, there's so many things going on in zone that I'm almost not worried about it. Because it's so difficult. Whether it's a little underpowered or a little overpowered, it's difficult to point to the specific thing that's causing the issue. But because Logia is simpler, the issues, if there are issues, ought to be more apparent, for good or for not. Now we get into Haki. We're almost through with this. Haki is the power system, the secondary power system. There's armament, observation, conquerors, and for our purposes, we're adding a cipher Haki. So Haki is the manifestation of willpower. So I've said this at various points throughout the video. Willpower, willpower, willpower. Willpower is important in One Piece. It allows you to have an effect on your environment, and Haki is the formal system through which that operates. High-level characters, specifically characters above level 8, which we'll see in a minute, will almost always have Haki. And what type of Haki they have is largely determined by their personality. Armament Haki, for instance, allows you to manifest your will physically, to empower attacks or empower yourself against attacks, and is very common among people who have strong wills, strong and indomitable wills, usually tending towards the lawful alignment. And if you remember before, I've mentioned this at various points, Armament Haki, when it's used, allows you to bypass the natural resistances and immunities of the transformed Paramecia, and as well as the shift form and shifting form of the Logia Sorcerer. So Armament Haki is a natural counter. Armament Haki additionally is invisible to anyone who does not know Haki. To those who can see it, the affected area appears as if coated in black steel. Observation Haki is common among people with reactionary personalities, people who want to make informed decisions, people who would generally be considered the reasonable person of the group, the negotiator, the diplomat. And what it does is it allows you to gather information. That's what observation Haki specializes in, gathering information and then reacting to it. Cipher Haki is common among people who have duplicitous personalities, people who are tricksters, who like to keep their true strength hidden. It's common among Cypherpole. While the other Haki types tend to be a bit more supernatural, Cipher Haki tends to be a bit more abstract and has a lot wider abilities. Conqueror's Haki is the rarest type and is only common among those considered to be king candidates, which are people who for all intents and purposes, have enough charisma to theoretically become a great king, great leader. People with Conqueror's Haki tend not to take well to being subordinates. And Conqueror's Haki is also known to be the only form of Haki which is innate. Anyone can learn Cipher Haki, anyone can learn Observation Haki, anyone can learn Armament Haki. It's just your personality gives you natural leanings towards one or another, but that's not true of Conquerors. Conquerors is innate. You are born with it, and it is awakened over time. So let's go over it. The actual system. Starting at level 8, players gain 1 Haki dice per level. This is one of those asterisks. I might recommend using 2 dice instead. I'm using 1 dice because, if you remember what I said before, I'm a bit conservative in how I give these things out. However, for campaigns which are anticipated to not go on very long, maybe 2 dice would be more appropriate, because you start to get them at level 8, so it's a late game system. So, you gain Haki dice. If you on a short rest, you gain half the dice that you've used, and on a long rest, you get all of them. When you reach level 8, you choose a Haki type and a Haki application, and then every 3 levels, you may choose a new application. And for the record, if you branch into a new type, you automatically get a free application. You don't need to branch into a type and then branch to an application. That would be miserable, and I would not recommend it. No, you get a Haki type and an application. Whenever you get a Haki type, you also get an application. That's important. Using Haki dice is a free action unless stated otherwise. So armament. So there's actually skill trees. So I'll go by the skill trees. So Black Blade. Spending 1 Haki dice, you coat your weapon with Haki, and you add 1d4 to both the attack roll and the damage roll, both. This is also what allows you to counter the Paramecia transformation and the Logia shift form. You can use 2 dice on the same roll if you like, but you can't use more than 2. And you have to use the ability prior to rolling. Second ability in this particular tree is Steel Wind, which allows you to expend Haki dice to make your melee attack into a long-range attack, so that gives you a bit more versatility. Finally, you get the Supreme Blade, which you can only get at level 17. Players attune themselves to non-magic weapons, which makes the weapon magical. It automatically becomes a +4 magic weapon, and the weapon loses its effect if you attune to a different weapon, but it will retain if it's separated or when the user dies. It is a black blade, and it does consume a magic item slot. So, when you reach level 17, you get Supreme Blade, which allows you to make your favored weapon into a +4 magic weapon. Does this stack with the weapon already having? So if you have a +4 magic weapon, and then you make it into a black blade, does that then become a +8? I'm going to say no. I'm going to say it caps at +4. I'm going to say no. I'm going to say no. In fact, I would contest that if a +4 magic weapon existed in the One Piece world, it would already be a black blade. It just wouldn't be your black blade. That would be my contention. The second tree is hardening. By expending Haki dice, you roll 1d4, and you can add that value to your AC. It's a reaction, and it lasts until the start of your next turn unless you are hit. So if you receive a successful attack, then the hardening goes away, and you can only use 1 dice per use. The second in the tree is black body. You can coat your entire body for 1 minute. Sorry. You roll 1d4, and you add that value to your AC. So for hardening, you roll 1d4 and you add that to your AC, but you can only use that for a turn. Black body allows you to do that, but it lasts for a minute. But unfortunately, the effect ends if you use Haki dice for a different ability. So if you roll 1d4 and you get 1, it's much worse, and you might need to cancel the ability in order to increase your chances of success. The final in the tree is Iron Balloon, which just you need level 17, which is common for all of the final application skill trees, and you get a permanent +2 to your AC. Permanent +2. Finally, you get Gorilla. By expending 1 Haki dice, you surge with willpower, adding 1d4 to any strength or con ability check or saving throw, and you can use up to 4 in a single use. The second is Guts, which allows you to course willpower through your body to resist incoming attacks. You roll 1d4 and add the value as temporary HP, and you can use up to 4. It can be used as a reaction. Finally, you gain Dragon Scales, which gets permanent resistance to non-magical bludgeoning, slashing, and piercing. So non-magical physical damage. Now we get into observation type. The first tree is the Mind's Eye tree. Expend 1 Haki dice and add 1d4 to either an insight or investigation roll. Up to 4 dice can be used at once. This can be done after rolling the first dice. Second is Danger Soul. Use 2 Haki dice to sense any and all traps and devil fruit /Haki /magic objects within a 20-foot radius. You can also use these die to A, deny an incoming sneak attack, removing advantage of sneak attack damage, or B, use a reaction during an enemy's sneak attack round. Finally, you get Voice of All Things. The character is passively aware of all creatures and living objects within a mile radius and can make a perception check to see what they're saying. On a successful insight check, the player can see the color of the soul by expending 1 Haki dice, allowing them to discern the alignment, general personality, general combat / danger, and immediate intent of any living creature. The second is Spirit Sense. Whoops. Expend 1 Haki dice and add 1d4 to either an initiative roll or dexterity saving throw. Up to 2 dice can be used at once. Second is Future Sight. Use 1 Haki dice. Any abilities which must be used prior to making a roll can now be applied after rolling the first dice. This includes other Haki abilities. You could also use 1 Haki die to assist an ally, warning them of an incoming trap or attack which requires a dex saving throw, and give them an additional 1d4, or advantage if you are in melee range of the ally but out of range of the trap or attack, or have exceeded your own saving throw. So if an ally is about to be hurt, you can use a Haki die to give them 1d4 on their saving throw. Finally, Future Correction. Players can expend 1 Haki dice to re-roll any roll and take either. They can spend 4 Haki dice to redo an entire turn of combat, undoing all actions starting again from the beginning of their turn. I understand that ability is the bane of a lot of people's existence, and there's going to be a lot of DMs who are not happy about it. My response would be, if you can, by the time you reach level 17, it shouldn't be that big of a deal to just undo the damage done. And this is for simple things like a player did an action and it didn't have the result that they expected. They can correct. That's what it allows them to do. It's essentially a in-universe mechanic that allows them to retcon. The final tree is Sniper Sight. Expend 1 Haki dice and add 1d4 to either a perception check or ranged attack roll. Up to 2 dice can be used at once. Very simple. Second is Sniper Shot. Use 1 Haki dice to double your range with any ranged attack. You can use up to 5 dice at once. So if you use 5 dice, it increases 5 times. So if you have a long range attack with a range of 30 feet, you can double it to 60 feet, or triple it to 90 feet, or quadruple it to 120 feet, or finally quintuple it to 150 feet. But of course that would require 5 dice. And finally, you have Sniper Skill. Critical hit threshold decreases by 1, and whenever the user critically succeeds with a ranged attack, they may ricochet the shot to hit another target with the same AC or lower. relatively simple, I think. Cipher. First is the finger pistol tree. Whenever attacking with a melee strike that deals bludgeoning or slashing damage, expend 1 Haki dice to receive advantage on the attack roll and make the attack deal piercing damage instead. I think fairly simple. The second in the tree is Secret Pistol. When using the finger pistol ability, the target cannot use a reaction with the exception of legendary actions and resistances. So, say for example, you're fighting a Logia. If you have Secret Pistol, you can attack them, and the Logia will not be able to use Shift Form, so you can attack them without Haki. And you have advantage on the attack, because it's finger pistol. Finally, the final one in the tree is Rokuogan. When you make an unarmed attack, the user can choose to expend Haki dice to deal an attack without touching their opponents. Each Haki dice counts as 1 unarmed attack. It is a guaranteed hit, with the target having to make a con saving throw against the user's constitution score to half the incoming damage. Up to 5 dice can be used at once. This consumes the attack action. So what Rokuogan is, it's guaranteed damage, is what it is. It allows you to deal damage to your opponent, guaranteed, but it also means that the threshold is much lower, because if they succeed their saving throw, then all of that damage is halved, even if it was guaranteed. The second tree is the Iron Body tree. Expend 2 Haki dice and gain advantage on any strength or con saving throw and increase AC by 2 as a reaction until the start of your next turn. This effect is removed if the user takes damage or falls victim to a spell effect. So what it does is it's similar to Iron Body, except that it is more consistent, but also more expensive. Second is Paper Body, which is like Iron Body, except you gain Dex. And, I'm sorry, that should say increase AC by 2. Ignore that. That should say increase AC by 2. It cannot be used with Iron Body at the same time. So it's the same, except it's Dexterity saving throws instead of Con saving throws. And finally is Flow Body. When using Iron Body or Paper Body, the effect lasts for 1 minute. So if you notice, they both last until you take damage, or until they start, sorry, not until you take damage, until the start of your next turn. But Flow Body allows you to use it for 1 minute, instead of just as a reaction. So it makes the abilities much more powerful, because they're able to last multiple turns of combat. Finally is the Shave tree. Use 1 Haki dice to move instantaneously to any location within your movement range as your movement action or as a dash action. So either as your movement or dash, or both, but that would require 2. And you move without inducing opportunity attacks. Pretty simple. Moonwalk. Use 1 Haki dice to move through the air or water at your movement speed as part of your movement action or dash action. So you can use 1 Haki dice to move through the air or the water in your movement without incurring any difficult terrain. And for the record, this would allow you to move across difficult terrain without incurring anything, because you could basically just run over the ground. So, yes, it effectively allows you to nullify difficult terrain while also limited flight. Finally is Fan Hammer. Use 2 Haki dice to either make an extra attack or an extra reaction. Only 1 extra attack can be used per turn, but the extra reaction is limitless. So it gives you an extra attack. Extra action, I should say. Finally, we have Conquerors. Something important to note is that you cannot go into Conquerors until level 11. You can't. But at level 11, you get Conqueror's Blast. You expend 4 Haki dice and make an Intimidation check. All enemies in a 60-foot radius whose current health is below this number will be instantly knocked unconscious, except targets who possess Haki. Characters with Haki whose health is under the threshold will be disoriented. They will be unable to use Haki legendary actions or legendary reactions for 1 round. If faced with an opposing Conqueror's Blast, the user can make a blast of their own, negating the original when meeting or exceeding the target value. So for those of you who are fans of One Piece, this should look pretty familiar. You can knock people unconscious. It's, for D&D people, you can think of it as a super sleep spell with certain ways that you can counteract it if you also have Haki. Then it has 3 applications. So Unconquerable. use Haki dice to add 1d4 to any charisma or wisdom saving throw. This can also be used to add imaginary hit points. So if there's a Conqueror's Blast coming your way and your threshold is just under it, you can use Unconquerable to supersede it without actually having to make a Conqueror's Blast of your own. So you can beat the value with 1 Haki dice instead of making 4 and hoping that you roll higher. The second possibility is King's Candidate. Use Haki dice to add 1d4 to any persuasion or intimidation roll, including Conqueror's Blast intimidation. Up to 4 must be used at once, but you have to declare it before the roll. Finally, Red Lightning. You expend 2 Haki dice and you can add your Charisma modifier to your next attack or damage roll. To your next attack and damage roll, including spells. And that is Haki. That is Haki. And that is essentially Pirates and Power Holders. I will touch on navigation really quick, just to go through, but essentially this is what you really need to know right here. This is a random events table. The random events include weather. So whenever you roll a random event, which is not weather, it is assumed that it is a clear day. However, if you like, you may roll on the weather table as well. It's a D100. It's pretty simple. And this is also where the nav checks come in. So all of these you see here, these are the navigation checks I was talking about earlier. So these are the checks that your navigator will be making as you travel. As you can see, if you just skim it, some of these are pretty nasty. So having a navigator who is wise or intelligent is rather useful. So navigators are good to have. You can whirlpool, sky goes pitch black and remains as such for 1d3 days. The sea ahead is filled with sharknadoes. There's a lot. There's a lot that you can do, and things get pretty crazy. And then we'll just touch again on the quick reference tables, which are just down here at the end. It's exactly what it sounds like. These are quick reference tables for meals, for currency conversion, and for potions. So instead of searching through the book, you can just turn to here. And that is Pirates and Power Holders. My voice is tired. But I will repeat what I said before. I spent a lot of time on this. I worked hard on this. It's not perfect. It is still in beta, to use a phrase. And I would appreciate it if all of you would help me out as best as you can. What I've done is I've opted to create a skeleton. A skeleton for you, for your friends, for anyone who wants to craft their own One Piece story, their own One Piece world. I've done my best to make it authentic. I've done my best to make it palatable. I've done my best to make it balanced, but at the end of the day, I am only a man. And I'll repeat what I said at the start. There are no rules, only suggestions. Take everything that's in this book with a grain of salt. But more than that, I would like to make a personal request. The personal request is that you enjoy it, that you have fun with it, and that even if it's not perfect, you at least enjoy it. That's my request. Enjoy it at your table, enjoy it with your friends, have fun. Because at the end of the day, all of this, it doesn't have to be perfect. Creating a One Piece experience for your players is more important than having it be balanced. Having it be authentic and fun is what's really important, and I think I've more or less done that. I've not done all the work. You'll need to step in yourself. There are things that you will need to do as the DM, especially where devil fruits are concerned, because devil fruits are a mess. Devil fruits are a mess. Your job is not done. I have not done your job for you. But I have given you a foundation, and I hope that you use it. I hope that it is useful to you. And above all, if you're here, thank you for watching. Thank you for being patient with me. Thank you for dealing with me. Thank you for dealing with all of this. And most importantly, enjoy it. Because that's what these things are made to do. They're made to be enjoyed. Because at the end of the day, I think everyone here loves One Piece, loves Oda, loves Dungeons and Dragons. And not only is this book a labor of love, but all of your dungeons, all of your campaigns are labors of love as well. And under that, we are united. Stay tuned for updates. Again, what was displayed in this video is not up to date, almost assuredly. So, stay tuned. Perhaps some of the issues brought up will have already been fixed by the time you come around to it. But for now, that's all.